My daughter used my wife's memorial gala to unveil luxury residences on the land we had given to the town, then told 200 guests that grief had finally convinced me to step aside. She said it with one manicured hand resting on the podium and the other extended toward a rendering of glass terraces, private courtyards, and something called the Mercer Collection of Heritage Homes, as if the sale of a public promise were simply another stage in a beautiful family evolution. People turned toward me with that strained, charitable expression the living reserve for widowers they assume have become too fragile to interrupt. No one spoke. No one had to. The orchestra had already gone silent. The servers were holding trays of salmon no one was eating. The giant screen over the ballroom still glowed with the image Cole had chosen for the reveal, a twilight rendering of our winter garden converted into warm amber windows for people who would pay more for one night in those rooms than some of our school groups raised in a month. And there I was in the second row, 71 years old, black suit, white shirt, my wife's wedding band hanging on a thin chain beneath my collar, listening to my daughter announce my retirement from the foundation I built with my own hands. My father has carried this place through my mother's illness with extraordinary devotion, Vivian said, her voice breaking in just the right place for the donors nearest the stage. But love also means knowing when to let go. In her final weeks, my mother told us she wanted Hart House to evolve. She didn't want it to become a burden on him. Tonight we're honoring that wish. Then she turned toward me with a smile so polished it looked laminated. Dad, we all know this is what Mom wanted. That was the line that almost made me stand too soon. Not because it was cruel. Because it was sloppy. Margaret would never have said burden. She hated that word. She used to tell our staff that a garden, a marriage, and a town all died the same way, not from storms, but from people deciding ordinary care had become an inconvenience. Vivian knew that. Cole did not. That was the first crack. The second sat in the lower right corner of the rendering behind her. Most people in that ballroom were looking at the terraces, the lights, the view line over the reflecting pond. I was looking at the property mark. Parcel C. A graceful sweep of lawn, stone paths, and greenhouse glass represented as development-ready land under Mercer Heritage Living, Phase 1. Parcel C did not belong to them. Parcel C did not even belong to me anymore. I had moved it 22 days earlier. So I stayed seated. That surprised Vivian. I saw it in the tiny tightening at the edge of her mouth. She had expected outrage, tears, a scene, something she could point to later as evidence that grief had made me volatile. Instead I folded my hands in my lap and gave her nothing. Cole, standing just off stage in a dark blue suit that fit him like ambition, relaxed visibly. He took my stillness for surrender. He always mistook silence for weakness because he had spent his whole life around people who spoke to hide how little they knew. Vivian continued. As of tonight, the board has asked me to serve as interim chair while we guide Hart House into its next chapter. Cole will oversee strategic development partnerships, and we are thrilled to announce a private capital commitment that will preserve the estate for generations. Preserve. That was the third lie in 4 sentences. The room applauded politely, then more confidently once enough people saw enough other people doing it. I did not clap. Neither did Ruth Alvarez. Ruth sat 3 chairs to my left in a charcoal suit and low heels, silver hair swept back, face unreadable. Most of the room knew her only as the lawyer who had handled Margaret's estate. They did not know she had been my closest friend for 36 years, had once told a county commissioner to his face that he had the ethics of spoiled yogurt, and had spent the last 3 weeks helping me pull apart a structure my daughter believed she had already secured. When the applause peaked, Vivian stepped away from the podium and looked toward me. Dad, she said softly into the microphone, suddenly tender, suddenly daughterly, would you like to say a few words? There it was. The trap within the tribute. If I refused, I would seem diminished. If I spoke angrily, I would seem unstable. If I cried, they would say the evening had simply become too much for me. I rose anyway. At the edge of the stage, one of the event boys moved as if to offer me a steadying arm. He could not have been more than 19. I smiled and waved him off. Behind him, at the head table, I noticed that my place card was gone. That detail told me more than the speech had. Vivian had not come to honor Margaret. She had come to replace me in front of witnesses. I stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone myself. The room settled. Outside the ballroom windows, the winter garden glowed under its night lights, the same blue-white wash Margaret loved because it made the conservatory glass look as if it were holding moonlight even in August. I looked at the donors, the teachers, the trustees, the old volunteers, the junior patrons, the local paper's arts editor, the deputy county clerk, the banker Cole had invited even though he pretended the financing was already secure, and finally at my daughter. Vivian is right about one thing, I said. My wife did ask for this place to be protected after she was gone. Cole smiled first. Vivian followed. Around the room, people softened. The widower had accepted the handoff. The children were doing what was best. The town could go home feeling sad and modern at the same time. Then I turned toward the projection screen and said, before we discuss what happens next, I'd like the staff to play one more recording. The last complete instruction Margaret ever gave me about the land behind this house. The smiles disappeared. At the back of the ballroom, Aaron from our archives booth looked toward Ruth. Ruth nodded once. The screen went black. I heard Vivian say my name under her breath, not as daughter now, but as warning. Too late. Because what happened that night did not begin with the recording. It began 6 months earlier, when my wife was still alive and my daughter still knew how to hide what she wanted behind flowers, meal trains, and the sort of concern that always arrives with a clipboard. My name is Thomas Hart. I have lived on Hart Hill for 47 years, in a stone house with leaded windows and cold corners and the kind of porch that teaches children patience because no one gets from the front steps to the driveway in a straight line. They stop for bees, for hydrangeas, for toads under the rain barrel, for the bronze fox at the east walk, for no reason at all except that beautiful places slow the body whether you ask them to or not. Margaret used to say I loved the property before I loved her. That was not true. But it was close enough to irritate me for 40 years. Hart Hill belonged to her family long before it belonged to mine. Her grandmother built the first greenhouse out of salvaged church windows and iron bought from a failing mill. Her father turned the lower meadow into formal gardens because he believed hard times required useless beauty on principle. When Margaret inherited the house, the land was grand and failing at the same time. The roof needed work. The boiler moaned. The public tours had become irregular. The non-profit status was a suggestion more than a system. The endowment was thin. The county loved the photographs and hated the repair estimates. Margaret loved the place like a daughter who had forgiven too much. I loved it like a man who could read a tax covenant. That was the balance between us. He charmed donors. I wrote bylaws. He walked schoolchildren through the orchid room and made them believe begonias had personalities. I sat at the dining room table long after midnight drafting maintenance reserve language and deed restrictions because beautiful places do not survive on sentiment, they survive on paperwork so precise it can outlive vanity. We were very good together. He knew how to make people feel invited. I knew how to make sure the invitation could not later be monetized by idiots. Vivian used to joke that Mom planted roses and Dad planted conditions. She said it with affection when she was younger. Later she said it with something closer to resentment. Our daughter grew up in rooms other people visited on purpose. That does something to a child. It teaches them early that beauty can be leveraged. A staircase becomes a photo backdrop. A conservatory becomes a venue. A donor luncheon becomes a ladder. Margaret saw Hart Hill as a public trust because she had known it before it was useful. Vivian knew it as atmosphere from the beginning. That does not make a child bad. It just means they learn value in the wrong order unless somebody corrects it. I am not sure we corrected enough. She was bright. Beautiful. Hard to embarrass. The sort of girl who learned very quickly that adults would mistake poise for judgment. Teachers described her as mature when what they meant was that she had already understood performance. Boys bored her unless they improved her position. Friends rotated. Her room stayed immaculate in the way spaces do when their occupant is always partly arranging herself for an audience. Margaret adored her. Of course she did. She had the helplessness mothers often reserve for daughters who resemble them in spirit just enough to feel like destiny and differ from them in ethics just enough to become dangerous later. I loved her too, but more cautiously. Even when she was 16 I had the uneasy sense that she experienced affection as a resource, not as weather. She could be warm, astonishingly so, but there was always calculation somewhere under the warmth, as if every relationship existed in two columns, what it cost and what it yielded. Still, she was ours. And most fathers know the temptation of translating warning signs into temperament because the alternative is admitting you may be raising a person the world will one day experience very differently than you do. Vivian left for New York at 23, married Cole Mercer at 28, and spent the next decade moving through boutique branding firms, hospitality launches, and what she called cultural partnerships. Cole came from development money that had mostly evaporated by the time he reached 30. He had good shoulders, excellent teeth, a voice built for boardrooms, and no native respect for institutions that did not produce private yield. He talked about underperforming assets the way normal people talk about weather. Margaret disliked him politely. I disliked him accurately. He looked at Hart House the way men look at old silver in a widower's cabinet. Not with admiration. With conversion already running in the back of the eyes. Margaret fell ill in February. Pancreatic cancer, advanced, efficient, uninterested in drama because the truly cruel diseases do not need theatrics. They announce themselves in ordinary details first. A man who used to eat peaches over the sink suddenly leaves half of one untouched. A waistcoat hangs wrong. A walk across the south lawn requires a pause at the sundial. Then comes the scan, the silence in the doctor's face, the folder placed down too carefully. We got 5.5 months. No one should call that time a gift unless they have never watched it cost somebody everything. There were good mornings in it. I want that said. We still had those. Tea on the porch. Staff updates. Lucy visiting with sketches from graduate school. Margaret insisting on walking the upper path twice a week long after her body had begun bargaining against every incline. But illness narrows the world fast. By April, Vivian was here almost daily. At first I was grateful. That is the humiliating truth. She came with soups we did not ask for, medications color-coded in little trays, spreadsheets for visiting schedules, lists of volunteers, florists, hospice liaison numbers, soft cardigans thrown over expensive slacks so that she looked like devotion in tasteful neutrals. Cole started appearing too, always under the pretense of helping with operations. You shouldn't be worrying about vendor contracts right now, Thomas, he told me one afternoon while Margaret slept upstairs. Let me take some of the load. No man who calls me Thomas in my own kitchen has ever arrived with harmless intentions. Still, grief makes people generous in stupid directions. I let him review the Gala calendar. I let Vivian sit in on 2 board calls. I let them talk about easing burdens and protecting continuity because part of me believed this was what adult children looked like when they finally grew into responsibility. Then Margaret worsened quickly. By June, the doctor had stopped using future tense unless pressed. One evening near the end, the house had gone quiet in that thick suspended way houses do when everyone is listening for the same upstairs movement. Margaret was half reclined in bed, too thin, skin almost translucent over the bones of her face, but her eyes still sharp in the maddening way of people whose minds remain intact while the body gives up room by room. She motioned for me to bring the estate box from the library. Not the jewelry drawer. Not the silver key cabinet. The black archival box from the lower shelf beside my desk, the one with the original trust schedules, old surveys, and the handwritten notes we kept from the foundation conversion 21 years earlier. I carried it upstairs and set it on the blanket. She rested her hand on the lid a long moment before speaking. "You remember why you insisted on the reversion language," she said. "Because everyone eventually thinks they are the exception." She smiled faintly. "You always did know how to flatter human nature." I sat beside her. "Why are we doing this tonight?" She looked toward the window. The east lawn was gold with late sun. The glass of the winter garden held the light like a second sky. "Because I know our daughter," she said quietly. "And because grief makes decent people accommodating and ambitious people faster." That line stayed with me. Not because it was profound. Because Margaret almost never said ugly truths aloud unless she had made peace with them already. She asked me to go through the property maps one more time. Parcel A, the house and main formal grounds. Parcel B, the public conservatory and education wing. Parcel C, the east meadow, service drives, lower greenhouse strip, and donor walk. Parcel D, the old carriage house, now archives and volunteer center. The public trust held operating control over the whole estate, but ownership and use rights were layered carefully through deed restrictions, donor covenants, preservation agreements, and a reversion clause tied to private commercial conversion. "If they try to sell the gardens," she said, her voice weaker now, "don't let mourning make you generous." "I won't." "Promise me clearly." "I promise clearly." She nodded, then added the part one did not realize I would later need more than the maps. "And if anyone tells you I asked for something I didn't ask for, make them prove it with my exact words." Margaret knew what language meant. That was one reason we lasted. She died 9 days later. The funeral was full in the way funerals are for women who have spent 4 decades turning private land into public memory. Teachers came. Former interns came. Children who had once visited on third-grade trips came back as adults with their own children. Volunteers cried harder than some relatives. The choir got through the anthem only because Ruth sang loudly enough to terrify fragility out of the room. Vivian gave a beautiful eulogy. "I want that acknowledged too." She told the room exactly who Margaret had been in public. Margaret's optimism. Her warmth. Her patience with schoolchildren and old men and impossible peonies. She did not mention the estate box, the property maps, or the promise Margaret had extracted from me in the last week of her life. Why would she? That private part of Margaret did not serve Vivian. In the first 10 days after Margaret's funeral, the house behaved like a train station dressed for mourning. Doors opened. Shoes gathered at thresholds. Soup arrived. Coats were draped over dining chairs by people who meant well and stayed too long because grief makes everyone afraid of being the first one to leave. That kind of crowd does not only bring casseroles. It brings access. Vivian understood that before I did. She became indispensable with such speed it almost looked holy. She had clipboards. Menus. Volunteer schedules. A florist's cell number. A recommendation for a stronger tent company in case the autumn gala needed to be moved off the lower lawn. Every practical problem that death throws at a household, she met with a smooth solution and the exact correct expression. People love capability in a grieving daughter. They confuse it with goodness because the packaging is elegant. I did too, for longer than I should have. Cole was clever enough not to lead in those early days. He stayed one step behind her, carrying folding chairs, taking calls in the side hall, murmuring about logistics in a voice tuned just low enough to sound respectful. He never argued with me outright while the condolence flowers were still fresh. He asked questions instead. Questions about event insurance. Questions about deferred maintenance. Questions about the donor calendar for the remainder of the year. Questions about how quickly the board could meet if something urgent required continuity planning. That last phrase reached me through fog at first. Continuity planning. It sounded administrative. Harmless. The kind of phrase decent people allow into a room because they assume it belongs to normal adult management. The problem with normal adult management is that it often arrives half an hour before predation and holds the door open for it. I remember one afternoon very clearly. The reception dishes had finally been cleared. Most of the flowers had begun to sour in the warm rooms. I was in Margaret's study sitting in her leather chair and failing at what people call sorting papers and what widowers know is simply touching objects until the day passes. Vivian knocked softly and came in carrying tea. I almost laughed. She never remembers tea. As a child she drank iced water with lemon and considered hot drinks a concession to people who had already given up. But there she was, porcelain cup, saucer, the whole act. She set it beside me and said, "You don't have to make every decision yourself now." It was a generous line. It was also reconnaissance. "I still can," I said. "Of course you can." Then, after a pause long enough to sound accidental, "But the estate has a lot of moving parts, Dad. Mom was the relational half of this place and you were the structural half. With her gone, people are going to look for certainty. We should think about how that looks." How that looks. Not what protects the place. Not what the trust requires. How it looks. I said nothing. She took my silence for opening and sat in the chair opposite the desk. "The autumn gala can't stay what it was," she said. "A retirement celebration would feel grotesque now." I agree. So it becomes memorial. Probably. And memorial means a different donor emotional profile. I looked up at her then. She heard it too late. How she had sounded. Not daughter. Not mourner. Development strategist. She softened immediately. "I don't mean exploitative," she said. "I mean people will be more willing to commit in her honor. There are moments when a father hears two voices in one mouth. The public voice, which is polished and reasonable. And the private engine underneath, which has already done the math. That was one of those moments. Margaret used to say Vivian could smell leverage through walls. She said it with pride when she was younger. By then it sounded like diagnosis. The house staff felt it before they named it. Marlene, who had managed the front desk and school bookings for 15 years, began knocking before entering my office in a way she never had before, as if hierarchy itself had become unstable. Gus, who supervised grounds, asked me twice within 1 week whether any changes were coming to the lower meadow paths because a man in city shoes had taken measurements without introducing himself. Miriam, our head gardener and unappointed minister of moral clarity, began saying Cole's name the way Catholics say mildew. What did he want? I asked her after the second complaint. She stood in my kitchen with a crate of cut basil under one arm and said, "The same thing men always want when they ask how much sunlight a place gets without first admiring the roses. He wanted to know what could be flattened. That is why I keep gardeners close. They speak fluent intention." Even Father James, who notices very little before dessert, noticed something. He came by with a covered dish nobody wanted and found Cole on the donor walk talking on speakerphone about premium occupancy at shoulder season. Father James told me later, with genuine confusion, I did not realize the church had started offering hotel language for the dead. I told him we had not. He said, "Good, because he sounded expensive." The strangest change arrived through the board. Not in any official action. In tempo. 2 longtime board members who had not visited in person for months suddenly began dropping by with condolences and very soft questions about my stamina. One wanted to know whether I had considered a temporary governance support structure until spring. Another, a man who once needed 3 follow-up calls to approve a gutter repair, was suddenly interested in whether my health would allow me to carry the property through winter. health, stamina, support structure, continuity. All those polite words had begun circling the same prey. And grief made me slower than I like admitting. Not stupid. Never that. But slower. There is a difference. Sorrow eats decision speed first. You can still recognize danger. You just take longer to admit you are the thing it is moving toward. By the second week I started testing them. Small things at first. I would say I felt fine when I did not and watch who seemed disappointed. I would mention the trust language casually and watch who changed the subject. I would ask where Cole had heard a certain maintenance number and note whether he answered directly. He never did. He answered like a consultant billing by the fog. Once you step back and look at the estate holistically. If we benchmark comparable heritage assets, there may be ways to unlock value without changing the soul of the place. Men who want to buy your soul almost always begin by assuring you they admire it. Lucy came down from Boston that second weekend and walked through the house like someone sensing a draft nobody else felt. She loved her grandmother honestly and therefore distrusted everything aestheticized around her death. At 23 she still moved through Hart House like a child who knew which floorboard near the winter pantry squeaked and which pear tree in the upper orchard produced fruit too ugly to photograph and therefore best suited for eating. She found me in the sewing room sorting letters into piles I had already forgotten creating. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No." "Good," she said. "You shouldn't be. Everyone downstairs is acting like grief is a committee assignment." That made me look up. She had Margaret's honesty when she forgot to protect people from it. A gift. "Has your mother said anything odd to you?" I asked. Lucy leaned on the window seat. "Only the normal odd things." "Define normal." "She says we need to think bigger. She says Grandma would want Hart House secure. She says philanthropy is changing. She says people under 50 don't donate to maintenance, they donate to transformation." I folded a black ribbon slowly. "And what do you think?" "I think anyone who uses the word transformation in this family usually wants a better bathroom and a worse conscience." I nearly smiled. That was when I first understood the difference between Vivian and Lucy in a way that had consequences. Vivian sees a beautiful thing and asks what scale it could reach if it stopped belonging to itself. Lucy sees a beautiful thing and asks what would let it remain itself longer. Those are not small differences. Those are civilizations. The next morning Cole brought a surveyor to the East Meadow without asking me. Not officially. Not brazenly. The man carried a tablet instead of a tripod and wore a navy quarter zip instead of a safety vest, which I suspect was meant to make him look like he had wandered there by intellect rather than contract. But Gus saw the flags by noon. Blue markers near the lower greenhouse strip. 3 by the donor walk. 2 absurdly close to the children's compost beds. I called Vivian immediately. She answered on the first ring in her hushed concerned voice. A surveyor was on the East Meadow. A beat. Then, probably just for drainage review. Without telling me. Cole may have asked someone to do a quick look since the lower path floods in spring. The lower path does not flood in spring. She went quiet. That mattered more than any apology. The lie had not been prepared around accurate land behavior. Which meant someone was building narrative faster than fact. I walked out there myself that afternoon. The grass still held the faint bruising from the stakes. It is remarkable how obscene a little plastic flag can look when it appears on land somebody has already started imagining into profit. I stood by the donor walk and looked across the meadow toward the winter garden glass and understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to feel noble, that they were not waiting to see what I would do. They were measuring what they thought I would fail to stop. That evening, while the house filled again with decent people carrying pie and softness, Cole cornered 2 mid-level donors by the library fireplace and began speaking about legacy experiences. I watched him from the archway. One hand in pocket. Shoulders relaxed. Head tilted at exactly the angle men use when they want other people to feel included in their own seduction. He said Hart House needed a more resilient revenue model. He said memory and sustainability were not enemies. He said the next generation was willing to pay for meaningful immersion if heritage spaces learned to speak the language of modern stewardship. One of the donors, poor woman, looked moved. She had known Margaret for 19 years and still had no defense against well-lit nonsense. The other asked whether the educational programs would remain intact. Cole gave the answer he always gave when he wanted to sound reassuring while preserving room for harm. At the center of everything, he said. At the center. Like a decorative fountain in a hotel lobby. That night I went upstairs and opened Margaret's wardrobe. Not because I needed clothes. Because her sweaters still smelled faintly like cedar, lavender, and the lower note of warm skin no perfume company has ever properly understood. I stood there in the dark a long time with one hand on a jacket sleeve and admitted something uglier than grief. I had let them too close too early because part of me wanted relief. Wanted someone else to carry folders, answer emails, soothe donors, fold chairs, decide menus, interpret sympathy. That is the shame greedy people rely on. They do not need you to be foolish. Only tired. The next morning I locked Margaret's study, moved the estate box into my private office, and told Marlene no one was to answer Foundation email under my name without direct instruction. By lunch Vivian knew. By 2 she was at my door asking whether she had done something wrong. And because I was not yet ready to show her how awake I had become, I gave her the saddest answer available. No, I said. I'm simply not done being my wife's widower before I become your transition problem. She cried. Beautifully. That was how I knew I was right to become dangerous. After the funeral, the house filled with flowers, casseroles, and the strange administrative intimacy death creates. Names to notify. Thank you notes. Insurance riders. Seasonal staff decisions. Temporary black ribbons on the gate. Half the town wanted to help. None of them knew how, which made them ideal raw material for people like Cole. By the second week after the burial, he had already started using phrases like strategic continuity. By the third, he was talking about legacy alignment. By the fourth, Vivian had brought me a binder. That was the real beginning. The binder was cream linen with a gold foil title stamped on the cover. Margaret Hart Legacy Transition Framework. That title alone told me Cole had touched it because Margaret would rather have been buried twice than let somebody call a family land fight a framework. Vivian placed it on the breakfast table between us and said, very gently, Dad, before people start circling with ideas, I think it would help if we were proactive. There are sentences that arrive dressed as care and leave the room wearing your furniture. That was one of them. I opened the binder. Renderings. Consulting memos. Revenue projections. Naming opportunities. A phased plan for converting the East Meadow and Lower Greenhouse Strip into what they called heritage residences for sustaining patrons. Private cottages. Wellness suites. Members-only dining. Curated seasonal stays. It was real estate dressed in silk language and tied with ribbons of philanthropy. Absolutely not, I said. Vivian had anticipated resistance. I could see it in how quickly she leaned into sorrow. Dad, please don't react to the phrasing. The point is to secure the future. Admissions are down, grant cycles are tightening, and no one can keep pouring themselves into this place the way you and Mom did. We need something self-sustaining. We have an endowment. A modest one. We have donor restrictions. Cole entered from the terrace door right on cue carrying a mug he had no business lifting in my house. Restrictions can be modernized, he said. I looked at him. No man who uses the passive voice around assets he doesn't own should be trusted with a stapler. Not these, I said. He smiled. Everything is negotiable if the mission remains intact. That was the moment I knew they had not read the original deeds closely enough. Not because he was wrong about the world. Because he was wrong about me. I let the binder sit closed after that. I did not throw it out. I did not stage indignation. I simply said, this house has had enough ambition in it for 1 month, and asked Vivian whether she would help me sort condolence mail instead. She agreed because she still believed I could be managed through mood. For the next 10 days, she and Cole came every afternoon. He reviewed catering contracts for the autumn donor gala that had originally been intended as Margaret's retirement celebration and was now drifting toward memorial. She met with staff. They answered emails I had not authorized them to answer. They started speaking about the foundation in first-person plural, the way people do when they are trying on ownership before witnesses. I noticed little things. Cole referring to the board as if it were inevitable. Vivian correcting long-time staff on operational details she had never cared about until inheritance entered the room. A consultant from Philadelphia walking the East Meadow with a drone case and pretending he was here to assess drainage. Lucy visiting one afternoon with printed elevations and looking uneasy when she realized I had seen them. Lucy is Vivian's daughter, 23, serious in the best way, all long bones and good questions, studying landscape architecture in Boston. She got Margaret's patience and, mercifully, none of her mother's appetite for using rooms against people. That day she found me in the orchid room trimming dead heads more harshly than the plants deserved. "Grandpa," she said, hovering in the doorway, "did Mom show you the revised concept package? The one with private cottages where the school greenhouse stands?" Her face changed. "They told me they were only studying donor options." I laid the shears down. "Lucy, what exactly have they told you you're helping with?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I met the first truly useful ally I had. "They said it was a stewardship expansion," she said finally. "Low impact. Hospitality adjacent. More like residencies for artists and botanical fellows. But the renderings I saw last week had plunge pools. Botanical fellows do not generally require plunge pools." I almost smiled. "No," I said. "They do not." She pulled a folded set of prints from her tote. "I shouldn't give you these if Mom hasn't," she said. "Then don't think of it as giving. Think of it as refusing to be used decoratively." That won me the plans. They were worse than the binder. The public paths had been reconfigured into private approach drives. The East Meadow was divided into lots by elegantly curved stone walls that would have destroyed the open line children used when they ran from the koi pond to the old fig house during summer tours. The education greenhouse was marked Flexible Event Annex. The volunteer center had become concierge office. The lower orchard, planted in memory of our first grant chair, had turned into guest parking. At the bottom of the title page, in very small print, sat the development entity. Mercer Living Partners. Not Hart House. Not the foundation. Mercer. I felt the kind of anger that clarifies rather than blurs. The useful kind. "Did your mother tell you this entity would hold the project?" I asked. Lucy shook her head. She said it was just the consultant's shell for fee routing. Fee routing. Another sweet phrase for dirty work. "Have you shown these to anyone else?" "No. I didn't know if I was overreacting." "You weren't." She sat down on the bench opposite me. Through the greenhouse glass, the south lawn shimmered in late July heat. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "what are they doing?" I could have answered with rage. I could have said stealing, positioning, circling, monetizing grief. Instead I said the truest simple thing. "They're trying to turn your grandmother into branding and me into an obstacle." Lucy looked down at the plans. "Mom said Grandma wanted change. Then she can produce Grandma's exact words." That line had become a key inside me. The next morning I took the binder, Lucy's plans, and the black archival box to Ruth. She was at her office over the bakery on Maple Street, already arguing on speakerphone with a man about a cemetery easement when I walked in. She pointed to the chair, finished verbally disassembling him, hung up, and said, "You look like someone has tried to sell your wife's bones by square foot." Close enough. We spent 3 hours at her conference table. Ruth read faster when she was angry. She began with the binder, then the plans, then the old deeds and trust schedules. By noon she had removed her glasses twice and pinched the bridge of her nose so hard I became briefly concerned for circulation. "They've built the whole thing around ambiguity," she said. "That's the first sign amateurs think they're clever." She tapped one paragraph in the binder. "Listen to this. Private residency options may support educational mission continuity through restricted premium occupancy." That sentence wants to be a condo so badly it's embarrassing. I handed her the development entity page. She read the name and snorted. Mercer Living Partners. Oh, subtle. Then she opened the deed packet. This was my territory, but Ruth read it with the kind of joy only lawyers and sociopaths ever find in really good constraints. Parcel A, Hart House, held under the Maine Preservation Trust. Parcel B, Winter Garden and Education Wing, Public Use Covenant, no private lodging, no exclusive access beyond charitable programming. Parcel C, East Meadow, Lower Greenhouse Strip, Donor Walk, and Orchard, all under reversion language I drafted 21 years earlier after a donor board member casually suggested private rentals might someday be useful. If any part of that parcel were pledged, transferred, or materially converted for private residential use unrelated to public educational mission, operational control reverted automatically to the Hart Educational Trust under county notice. Ruth looked up from the page. "Did you tell them this existed?" "No." "Good. You sound pleased." "I am. It's a very elegant trap for greedy descendants." That was the first genuinely comforting sentence I had heard in weeks. She kept reading. Then her expression changed. Not panic. Interest. She pulled out a second set of papers from the binder, board meeting notes drafted for circulation at the August governance session. At first glance they looked like preliminary discussion materials. Then she pointed to a line near the bottom. "Notice this." I read it. "In anticipation of transitional strain on current chair, executive authority may be delegated temporarily to acting family representative with strategic development support from Mercer Living Partners." Below that sat a line for my signature. Blank in the copy we held. Attached behind it was a scanned page bearing a wavering version of my initials next to a note authorizing Vivian to act on my behalf for preliminary negotiations. I stared at it. "I did not sign that." "I know you didn't." "Do you?" Ruth lifted the paper. "Because you never tilt your E that far right, even when you're angry, and because this woman tried to imitate hesitation without understanding your muscle memory. It's insulting, really." Ruth and I did not begin with emotion after that. We began with old paper, which in my experience is where respectable greed eventually leaves fingerprints. She spread the original trust schedules across her conference table and weighted the corners with 3 ugly ceramic pairs she kept for exactly this purpose. The bakery downstairs was making cardamom buns. A child cried in the stairwell. Somewhere on the street a truck reversed badly for too long. Real life went on making ordinary sounds while 2 women leaned over county language precise enough to ruin a polished man's September. "Tell me again why you insisted on the reversion trigger," Ruth said. "Because that clause had a history. And history matters when you're trying to understand whether a trap was built for this generation or inherited from the last one and merely redecorated. 21 years earlier, when Margaret and I converted Hart Hill from family estate with occasional tours into a real public trust with educational obligations, there had been one board member who heard the word preservation and immediately asked whether weddings could cover the roof. Not because he was evil. Because he was bored, rich, and constitutionally unable to look at old stone without asking how many nights it could be rented at premium rate. His name was Gerald Nance. He wore suspenders and cuff links shaped like fox heads and talked about civic duty as though it were a side effect of excellent breeding. He thought he was helping when he floated the idea. Private dinners in the long gallery. High-end seasonal stays in the carriage house. Perhaps one or two discreet cottages in the East Meadow for patrons of unusual generosity. I remember the exact light in the room when he said it. Late April. Rain on the glass. Margaret at the far end of the table still foolish enough to believe elegance corrected motive. I looked at Nance and saw the entire future wrong at once. How the first exception would become the second. How the second would produce a consultant. How the consultant would create language soft enough to carry theft through a vote. So I wrote the reversion clause. Not because I distrusted our donors collectively. Because I trusted repetition. Given enough time, some new Gerald always appears. The county attorney at the time thought I was overbuilding. Margaret thought the clause read like I had once been betrayed by architecture. Both men signed in the end because I had already done the harder work. I had drafted the trigger so that no one actor needed to behave well later. If the land crossed certain lines, the consequence activated. No debate. No special pleading. No emergency emotional governance. Just consequence. That was why Parcel C mattered so much. It was where beauty turned easy in a developer's mind. Open enough to imagine. Separate enough to package. Near enough to the winter garden that you could sell prestige by proximity and still pretend you were not selling the garden itself. Every greedy person sees the same meadow first. Which is why I protected it like a man who knew eventually a person he loved might be the one standing in the field with a brochure. Ruth listened to all that with the deep satisfaction lawyers experience when old paranoia matures into present usefulness. So you wrote the trap before the mice learned your blood type, she said. Essentially. Good. I like prepared men. Then she went back to the documents. The old donor covenants. The county record schedules. The preservation agreement with the State Historical Office. The educational mission exhibits. The little handwritten margin note Margaret once made beside a use restriction, the only romantic gesture she ever inserted into legal paper. Never let beauty become admission by another name. When Ruth found that note she tapped it twice. That one we keep for later, she said. Judges like dead men more when they sound concise. Dennis joined us that afternoon carrying 2 laptops, a legal pad, and an expression that suggested he had not been sincerely surprised by human conduct since the late 90s. He specialized in tracing polite theft. Foundations, non-profit drift, vanity capital, executive leakage, mission laundering. All the white-collar ways people convince themselves they are not stealing because the wallpaper is tasteful. He started with the obvious entities. Mercer Living Partners. Harrow Strategic. 3 consulting shells with names so sterile they almost apologized for themselves. 1 event services subcontractor that looked real until he noticed the reimbursement flow. 2 donor advisory decks routed through a hospitality consultant in Philadelphia whose mailing address turned out to be shared with a branding studio Cole had used on a failed boutique hotel pitch 6 years earlier. He's not innovating, Dennis said. He's recycling. Explain. He already knows how to dress private lodging as cultural value. He just found a widower and a memorial setting he thought would lower resistance. That sentence should have humiliated me. Instead it steadied me. There is clarity in discovering you were not uniquely foolish, merely targeted by a familiar personality type with a more local accent. By Thursday Dennis had mapped enough to tell a coherent ugly story. Cole's last project had not merely underperformed. It had collapsed after a financing bridge was built on anticipated pre-sale commitments that never fully materialized. He had survived professionally by dissolving entities at the right moment, shifting advisory roles, and translating failures into strategic restructuring events for clients too embarrassed to admit they had funded nonsense. Vivian had entered that world thinking she was marrying polished ambition. What she actually married was a man who required other people's legacy to compensate for his own lack of durable product. That still does not explain her. Nothing ever fully explains betrayal. But it gave shape to the weather around it. Lucy, without meaning to, added another piece. She came by Ruth's office on Saturday with a memory she could not stop worrying. 3 months earlier, before Margaret's final decline had made everyone gentler than reason, Vivian had asked her to help build a site circulation study for future public event flow. Lucy had assumed it meant larger school fairs or donor dinners. Then Cole had quietly asked whether she could create one version with service access disguised as garden walls. He told her it was only so, conservative board members would not panic if they saw vehicles too close to the meadow. She had refused. He had laughed and told her she was still in school, which was exactly the kind of sentence men use when a young woman has just prevented something useful. "Do you still have the draft he wanted changed?" Ruth asked. Lucy did. Of course she did. Competent young women save things older men dismiss. That file showed something the polished renderings later tried to hide. A dedicated private drive line entering from the south lane. Not for school buses. Not for service deliveries. Not for public overflow. For residents. Residents with privacy expectations. Residents with premium access. Residents whose quiet arrival and departure would require children, volunteers, gardeners, and ordinary visitors to learn the choreography of getting out of the way. It also showed a small cluster of buildings near the lower orchard labeled initially as seasonal stay units before someone later softened them into heritage residences. I stared at those words a long time. Words matter because they reveal the stage before the costume. Seasonal stay unit is honest enough to be dangerous. Heritage residence is the lie you put on afterward when you need old money to feel ennobled by what is basically a boutique hotel in morning clothes. Ruth found something else in the county packet that made all of us quieter. A meeting request from 6 weeks earlier. Unpublicized. Exploratory. Filed through a consultant rather than directly through the foundation. The subject line was bland enough to pass in a crowded inbox. Preliminary compatibility discussion regarding adaptive educational use modifications. But the attached parcel map was not bland. It highlighted B and C together. That mattered because Cole's public line, when he bothered to offer one, treated the educational wing as untouchable and suggested only light support development in the meadow. The county filing told the truth earlier than the donor language did. Once people start tying parcels together on paper, they are not dreaming. They are sequencing. I called Charles Hensley from the board that evening and asked him a simple question. Had he approved any exploratory county discussion? He got so quiet I could hear him move his tongue against his teeth. Thomas, I only sat in because Vivian said you were overwhelmed and wanted the option space narrowed before bringing stress to you directly. There it was again. Not only moving without me. Moving in my name. The oldest trick in private capture. Frame secrecy as protection and protection as filial devotion. What did you see? I asked. Conceptual questions, he said. No commitments. What conceptual questions? He hesitated. Then, because even weak men occasionally remember they have daughters and mirrors, he answered honestly enough. Whether the county would consider mixed mission occupancy if the educational component remained visible. Visible. Not primary. Visible. Like a decorative moral sticker placed over revenue. After that call Ruth wrote 3 words at the top of her pad. They are already lying. Then she underlined it twice. The records did not stop there. Dennis traced a hospitality consultant payment routed through Harrow Strategic and found that it landed within 48 hours of a donor dinner held privately at a club in Philadelphia. No staff from Hart House were present. No educational materials were circulated. But one of the invitees later appeared on the Gala seating plan beside a regional lender known for bridge note rescue. Another had backed Cole before. The third sat on a museum auxiliary board and loved telling journalists that preservation must meet the century. I have rarely wanted to slap a century on principle, but there are moments. What all of this gave us was not yet a courtroom win. It gave us contour. And contour is what you need when grief is still making everyone around you eager to mistake audacity for concern. I began moving differently after that. Not openly. I did not stage war. I staged fatigue. That was Ruth's advice. Your daughter expects either sentiment or rage, she said. Give her neither. Give her fragility she thinks she can route around. So I did. I let pauses linger. I asked for repeated explanations as though concentration cost more than it did. I sat through 2 donor conversations without correcting obvious lies until the room itself began to note them. I let Cole carry binders he should never have touched because sometimes the fastest way to learn what a man wants is to watch what he handles as if ownership were already implied. People often misunderstand strategy in men my age. They think if we are not shouting, we are fading. Nonsense. Some of the coldest preparations in this world happen under old jackets with coffee cooling beside them. Miriam assisted without ever calling it that. One morning she came to my office with a tray of cuttings and said, I moved the volunteer lunch for Thursday because Cole told the caterers the East Service lane needed to stay clear for rentals. Rentals. His word, not mine. He corrected himself later to guest vehicles, which told me everything. She set the tray down. Also, he asked whether the lower orchard irrigation could be hidden better. Men do not worry about hidden irrigation unless they plan to photograph over it. Father James contributed in a completely different register. He invited Cole to speak at a parish planning breakfast under the excuse of discussing Hart House's autumn memorial events. Cole accepted because vanity and missionary opportunity are close cousins. By noon Father James called me with exactly one useful sentence. He told 3 retired bankers that underused sacred spaces need financial courage. I laughed for the first time in almost a month. Not because it was funny. Because the man was practically engraving evidence into public air now. The final county piece arrived through a clerk Ruth had once helped in a family property dispute and who therefore maintained the ancient American civic tradition of repaying competence with selective efficiency. She called late on a Monday and said, Your people asked a question they shouldn't have asked unless they think the answer can be hidden. What question? Whether automatic reversion could be delayed if a public statement of mission continuity accompanied filing. I sat very still. They knew. Or suspected enough to panic. That changed our timetable immediately. Because once greedy people realize there might be a real tripwire under the flowers, they either retreat or accelerate. Cole was not built for retreat. I already knew that. Which meant acceleration. Which meant the gala would no longer be a memorial with opportunistic side objectives. It would be the launch itself. The room where applause would be used as collateral. Ruth looked at me over the county printout and said, They want witnesses before they want legality. Why? Because if enough people see them holding the future, challenging them later will feel like cruelty. She was right. That is how reputation laundering works in real time. You create a scene large enough that anyone opposing it afterward looks petty, unstable, or unwell. I thought of all the little questions about my stamina. My health. My burden. My need for support. The board language. The donor grooming. The survey stakes. The private dinners. The drone. The consultant. The shell entities. The lender. Then I looked at the reversion clause again and felt something almost like calm. They thought the Gala would be the room that finished me. What they had actually built was a room where the truth, if timed correctly, could become social fact before any of them reached the parking lot. All we needed now was precision. And patience. And one good microphone. There are few comforts like a friend identifying your forged signature by the quality of the contempt it inspires. Can we stop them now? I asked. Ruth did not answer immediately. Instead she lined the forged page up beside the original schedules from the archival box. Yes, she said. But stopping them now only prevents a land grab. It doesn't expose the structure. Meaning if we blow this up today, Vivian cries grief. Cole claims preliminary misunderstanding. They apologize, say consultants overstepped, blame transitional confusion, withdraw politely, and everyone in town spends the next decade thinking you and your daughter had a sad little disagreement after your wife's death. She placed one finger on the development entity name. I want to know whether this shell has debt under it. Whether he has used your donor relationships to leverage anything. Whether private commitments have already been made. Whether there is bridge financing. Whether your board packet has more forged pages in versions we haven't seen. Whether Lucy is the only person they misled. Whether they are counting on your silence as strategy or as collateral. Collateral. You heard me. That was when my anger sharpened into method. Grief had made me tired. It had not made me stupid. By the time I left Ruth's office that day, we had a plan. Not revenge yet. Structure. I would do nothing visible. I would remain the widower. Quiet. Tired. Distracted. A little fragile if that helped them move faster. Lucy would keep listening without overtly switching sides. Ruth would trace Mercer living partners, review county filings, and pull every document Vivian had circulated in my name. I would let the August governance session proceed. And if my daughter wanted to remove me in public, I would give her enough rope to do it beautifully. There is power in being underestimated by your own child. It disgusts me that I had to learn how much. The August session took place in the old music room at Hart House, the one with the walnut paneling, cracked ivory piano keys, and 12-foot ceilings that make even modest lies feel operatic. Vivian arranged the flowers herself. White lisianthus. Green hellebore. Garden roses cut too tight to open before the meeting ended. She placed them in Margaret's silver bowl and set the arrangement at the center of the table like grief had a sponsor. The board arrived in shades of sympathy. Charles Fenwick from the bank, all gentle condolence and polished shoes. Marlene Wu from the school district, sharp eyes, practical haircut, no patience for decorative philanthropy. Father James from St. Bartholomew's, who had baptized Lucy and once fell asleep during a donor luncheon so fully that Margaret insisted it counted as contemplative support. Miriam Holt, our head horticulturist, dirt still under one thumbnail because real work had delayed her. And finally, Vivian, sliding into the seat beside me with a folder, a tissue, and that immaculate look of a woman who had already prepared her own account of the evening. Cole did not officially sit in. Of course not. He remained by the sideboard with the consultant from Philadelphia, hovering just outside deliberation while somehow always managing to be visible in every reflection. I spent the first half hour saying almost nothing. That encouraged them. Donors had been supportive. Summer programs were strong. Press interest remained high. The Memorial Gala in September could serve as both tribute and future-facing initiative. Everyone nodded at all the right times. Then Vivian opened the folder she had brought and began reading from a memo she said she and I had been shaping together in quiet moments over the past month. There are few things colder than hearing a lie spoken in your own house in the tone of shared sacrifice. In light of my father's understandable exhaustion, she said, eyes lowered just enough to look dutiful rather than triumphant, He has asked that I assume certain transitional responsibilities through the end of the year while we evaluate a preservation-forward sustainability strategy in line with my mother's final wishes. Then she slid copies down the table. One landed in front of Marlene. One in front of Charles. One in front of Father James. One in front of me. I read the first paragraph and felt something almost like admiration for the precision of the theft. Not because it was brilliant. Because it was so shamelessly moderate. No grand declarations. No vulgar overreach. Just enough soft language to transfer authority without making anyone in the room feel they had participated in a coup. Ruth had been right. Amateurs love ambiguity because they think it gives them cover. Thomas, Charles said gently, is this what you want? There it was. My opening. I let my eyes rest on the paper longer than necessary. Then I looked at the flowers, at Margaret's silver bowl, at the seat where she should have been, and allowed exactly the right amount of fatigue into my voice. I want time, I said. And I don't seem to be getting any. That answer confused them. Not enough to stop the meeting. Enough to unsettle the script. Vivian recovered first. Dad, we talked about this. You talked around it. The room went still. I could almost feel Cole recalculating from the sideboard. Not yet, I thought. Not here. Not enough. So I sighed, set the paper down, and added, I'm sorry. I'm not as clear as I should be. Margaret handled so much of the public side. I may need you to walk me through the development language more slowly. And there, in one sentence, I became useful to them again. Because once people decide you are slipping, they start telling you more than they should. Cole stepped forward as if reluctant to intrude. Of course, he said. No one is trying to rush you. This is simply about exploring options to keep the estate viable. Private options, Marlene said, not looking at him. Good for Marlene. He smiled the way men do when they believe women who ask hard questions are just being procedural on the path to agreement. Premium mission-aligned occupancy, he said. Father James blinked. That sounds private with a sweater on. I nearly loved him for that. Vivian laughed lightly. What we're really discussing is donor residency, retreat programming, and strategic partnerships. Through Mercer Living Partners, Marlene said. Again, no one should underestimate a good school administrator. Vivian's face remained composed, but I saw the flash in her eyes. Temporarily as a structuring entity. Owned by whom? Marlene asked. Cole answered too quickly. By aligned family interests at this stage, pending final board architecture. That sentence was so oily it could have powered the boiler. I let the conversation tilt just enough toward discomfort, then intervened in the exact way they would later regret. Perhaps the gala would be a better place to present a broader vision, I said quietly. Margaret believed people gave more generously when they could see beauty before numbers. Every head turned toward me. Vivian's surprise was almost imperceptible. Cole's was not. They had expected resistance or collapse. What I handed them instead was a stage. They took it. Of course they did. By the end of that meeting, the September Memorial Gala had become their launch event. Nothing formally transferred yet. No vote on authority. No signed delegation. But a narrative had been seeded. Thomas was tired. Vivian was steady. Cole had a strategy. The future required courage. Margaret would have wanted evolution. After the board left, Vivian lingered in the music room helping gather water glasses she had not poured. You surprised me, she said softly. I know. I thought you hated the idea. I looked at her then, really looked. My daughter in pearl studs and funeral black, hands elegant, face controlled, carrying my wife's legacy the way some women carry expensive scarves, as an enhancement first and only later a weight. I hate being cornered, I said. That's not the same thing. She relaxed. That mattered. Then she leaned in and kissed my cheek. Thank you for trusting me, she whispered. I did not answer because some lies should be left alone in the air to curdle on their own. The first real break came from Dennis Greer. Ruth brought him in 3 days later under the pretense of an endowment review, which was not even technically false. Dennis wore loud socks and smelled faintly of peppermint and toner. He had spent 20 years following nonprofit fraud through the respectable language rich people use when they think auditors are merely accountants with weaker imaginations. He took one look at the Mercer Living Partners packet and said, "Let's see who already expects to be paid." That is how decent investigations begin. Not with motive. With invoices. He traced the entity filings first. Mercer Living Partners had been formed 6 months before Margaret died. 6 months. Long before any public talk of sustainability. Long before the binder. Long before my daughter started telling people she only wanted to help carry the load. Registered Manager, Cole Mercer. Advisory Consultant, Harrow Strategic, a shell that Dennis untangled in under an hour and linked back to Cole's former partner in Philadelphia. Preliminary debt note, $180,000 issued against projected development fees. I read that figure twice. He borrowed before he had land rights, I said. Dennis nodded. Bridge debt. Betting on getting control. Can he cover it? Not comfortably. Then came the better part. A second, larger private commitment had been drafted but not yet funded. Conditional on donor event performance, preliminary board endorsement, and evidence of family governance alignment. That was the gala. Not memorial. Not tribute. Performance benchmark. Cole needed that room. He needed the applause, the photographs, the published narrative that I had stepped aside willingly, and enough donor enthusiasm to convert speculative debt into secured money. Ruth looked at me over the papers. Do you see it now? I did. They were not merely trying to inherit control. They were already spending their victory. That changed my anger. It made it colder. Lucy supplied the next piece without realizing how much it mattered. She came by one afternoon under the excuse of returning Margaret's fountain pen and ended up helping me deadhead roses on the North Walk. We had been quiet for a while when she said, "Mom asked if I'd be willing to speak at the gala about intergenerational stewardship. Would you?" She winced. Not if stewardship means a plunge pool where the children's fern house is. I smiled despite everything. Then she added, "She also asked whether you were sleeping." Sleeping. And whether you still remembered that Mom hated public scenes. I stopped trimming. There it was. Not a direct attack. Testing ground. Preparing character evidence. Did she ask anyone else that? Miriam, I think. And maybe Charles. She keeps saying she's worried grief is making you impulsive. I set the shears down carefully. Vivian had started building the soft wall. Not guardianship. Not yet. But concern. Concern is the first courtesy of reputation theft. Get enough people used to the idea that someone's judgment is under strain and you can later route almost any aggression through love. That evening Ruth and I made a list. Everyone Vivian had approached. Everyone who might later say, in perfect sincerity, that she only seemed worried for me. Then Ruth, because she is Ruth, said, "We need the original hospice clip." I blinked. What clip? The one she'll use if cornered. The one where Margaret supposedly asked for evolution. No woman like your daughter builds a narrative that specific without believing she has audio. Of course. I hated how obvious it was once said aloud. The hospice nurse had sometimes allowed family recordings in the last weeks. Small things. Messages. Stories. Fragments children told themselves would matter later. Vivian had hovered around those afternoons like a woman arranging candles. So we went through every digital folder from the summer. Voice memos. Video snippets. Uploads from Lucy. Shared drive backups. Old phones charged from dead drawers. At 11 that night, in a folder titled Garden Notes that only Vivian would think looked innocuous, we found it. Not one clip. 3. The first was harmless. Margaret in bed telling Lucy to remember that wisteria needs harder pruning than timid people ever allow. The second was worse. Margaret, exhausted, saying, at some point Thomas will have to decide what is too much for him. Vivian's voice off camera replying, maybe some of it needs to change. Then the recording ended. Clean. Short. Useful. The third was the full conversation. That was the one that mattered. It ran almost 4 minutes longer. Margaret, after the line about deciding what is too much, goes on. She talks about labor. About public trust. About how old houses become vulnerable when the next generation mistakes stewardship for extraction. She says, explicitly, that if anyone ever tries to sell the East grounds in pieces, I am to stop it. She says she knows Vivian loves beauty but does not always know the price of keeping it public. She says Cole sees opportunity where he should see obligation. She coughs halfway through and asks for water. Then she looks directly at Vivian and says, very weakly but very clearly, do not turn my death into a package. I sat at my desk after that clip ended and put both hands flat on the wood because I suddenly needed the room to stay still. Ruth, beside me, whispered, well. There it is. There it was. Not magic. Not a perfect weapon. But truth in his own voice, long enough that no one honest could pretend the shorter clip told the story. If Vivian had used the excerpt publicly, she had done it knowing what surrounded it. That mattered to me more than any deed. Land theft is one kind of betrayal. Editing a dying man's last caution into permission is another. By the second week of August, the shape of the whole thing was clear enough to map. They had formed the shell entity before Margaret died. They had taken preliminary debt against projected development fees. They had prepared a forged authorization in my name. They were seeding concern about my judgment. They planned to use the memorial gala as public endorsement, donor performance trigger, and narrative transfer. And beneath all of it sat a basic assumption. That I would behave like a grieving father before I behaved like the man who had written every clause that kept Harthill from being sold by people who arrived late and loved it cheaply. I wish I could say that knowledge steadied me immediately. It didn't. It made me furious in alternating directions. At them. At myself for not seeing the entity filing sooner. At Margaret for dying before she could see our daughter face consequences. At every donor who would later say they had no idea because none of them had ever needed to learn how greed dresses for charitable events. Most of all I was furious at the intimacy of it. My daughter knew exactly what parts of me to use. Margaret's death. My fatigue. My reluctance to create scenes in public. The town's instinct to protect a bereaved family from scrutiny. Even Lucy's decency. All of it had gone into the machine. So Ruth made me do something humiliating and necessary. She made me rehearse. Not speeches. Restraint. She sat across from me in my library and played Vivian. Dad, you're overtired and I need to protect you from making choices you'll regret. I would answer too fast. She stopped me. Again. But this time don't defend your sanity. People in the realm want that fight. So we did it again. Dad, everyone can see you've changed since June. Grief changes people, I said. And sometimes it impairs judgment. Only if the people around them benefit from calling it that. Better. Less heat. More bone. An hour later she played Cole. Thomas, this event needs cohesion. Donors cannot read uncertainty. Then stop selling them mine. Too clean, Ruth said. Save that one for when he deserves it in public. Once we understood the gala had become the chosen battlefield, every ordinary task around the estate split into two versions. The visible one. And the useful one. The visible version looked exactly how grieving institutions prefer to look from the outside. Invitations redesigned from retirement gold to memorial ivory. Table counts adjusted. The orchestra trimmed from 6 players to 4 because Vivian said full strings would feel indulgent. The lower hall repainted in a softer neutral because Cole insisted evening projection needed a cleaner surface. A commemorative booklet drafted. A guest list revised for tone. Nothing in that list would have alarmed a stranger. The useful version happened underneath. Aaron from Dennis's office building secure copies of every donor deck. Lucy forwarding render layers before her mother realized she still had access. Marlene quietly preserving calendar edits and email forwards routed through Vivian's temporary foundation credentials. Gus photographing each new stake, marker, and service flag that appeared near the East Meadow. Father James listening badly on purpose at exactly the right breakfasts. Ruth writing letters she hoped not to send and preparing motions she hoped not to need but would absolutely enjoy filing if provoked. Me sitting in rooms with my dead wife's china and letting ambitious people mistake composure for frailty. The hospice recording mattered more than anything else and almost escaped us. When Margaret entered hospice at home, Vivian took over much of the practical coordination. She scheduled nursing windows. Managed medication deliveries. Fielded volunteer calls. Filtered who came upstairs and when. At the time I had been grateful because the body can only carry so many tasks while also learning the hourly shape of losing a man. What I had not understood until later was how much access she had gained to his words. Not only what he said. What could be excerpted? What could be isolated? What could be lifted out of context and turned into permission? Margaret hated official legacy videos. Said they made dying men sound like endowment brochures. But one afternoon a hospice nurse named Elena, sweet enough to be trusted and practical enough to be useful, suggested recording a few messages for future family moments because patients sometimes found comfort in it. Vivian encouraged the idea immediately. Too immediately, in hindsight. She framed it as kindness. One clip for Lucy. One for me. One maybe for the staff. Something simple in case there were words Margaret later lacked strength to say. Margaret agreed because illness narrows resistance in boring directions. You stop fighting every sentimental suggestion if it buys everyone 10 calmer minutes. I had remembered the recording vaguely. A camera on a tripod. Late afternoon light. Margaret tired but alert. Vivian hovering just out of frame in that soft cardigan she wore whenever she wanted to look both competent and maternal. At the time it felt harmless. Later I would understand that it was not the filming that mattered. It was custody. By the time I asked Vivian directly whether a full copy existed, she was already practiced. Only fragments, she said. Mostly he was too weak. Then, seeing something in my face, she added, why? No reason. Dad. No reason, Vivian. There was, of course, a reason. Margaret had said enough things in her last month that only a fool would let my daughter summarize them unchallenged. Elena turned out to be the person who saved us. Not because she intended heroics. Because she had the old-fashioned professional instinct to duplicate everything before a family member could misplace it in the service of healing. Dennis found her first through vendor access logs. Then Ruth called, introduced herself with just enough solemnity to keep the word litigation hovering in the room without fully landing, and asked if Elena recalled any archived hospice media transferred to family custody. Elena did. She also recalled something else. Your daughter asked me for a clean copy and a trimmed one, she said over speakerphone. Trimmed how? I asked. She said the full take was emotionally difficult and she wanted a shorter family version with the strongest lines. Strongest lines. The language of predators and publicists. Did you provide both? I provided the raw transfer to the family drive and a courtesy shortened version because I thought I was helping. But the raw archive remains in our secure cloud for policy reasons. I closed my eyes when she said that. Not from relief. From fury at how close truth had come to being dressed and sold by the people least entitled to it. 2 days later Dennis sat in my office with headphones on and the full hospice recording playing from beginning to end. He listened once alone. Then again with me. Then a third time with Ruth because she trusts her own memory but trusts playback more. It was not a dramatic tape. That helped. No swelling music. No cinematic final declarations. Just Margaret in a bed near the west window, tired, dry-mouthed, occasionally losing the thread and then finding it again with that infuriating clarity good women sometimes maintain while the body betrays them. At one point she did say what Vivian later lifted. At some point Thomas will have to decide what is too much for him. She was talking about my body. My age. My sleep. My tendency to overstay the useful hour in any fight. Vivian planned to use the sentence as institutional surrender. What came after it was why she needed the edit. Margaret went on. He said if anything ever became too much, the answer was not private sale disguised as stewardship. He said Harthouse did not exist to become a reward for people who could pay to feel curated inside someone else's history. He said the East Meadow was to remain open because children running across open land taught more democracy than donor dinners ever had. Then, quieter, he said my name and asked me to make sure no one turned burden into an argument for betrayal. Burden. There it was again. Not his word except in warning. Never in surrender. We clipped the relevant sequence carefully. Not manipulated. Not theatrical. Just enough to preserve meaning while removing the coughing, the long pauses, the private family tenderness a ballroom did not deserve. The point was not to exploit a dying man. The point was to stop other people from exploiting him first. While Dennis handled the recording, Ruth pursued paper. We knew from the county inquiry that Cole had started worrying about the reversion clause. What we did not yet know was whether he intended to bluff through it, override it through narrative, or neutralize it procedurally. The answer came through a notary. That sentence sounds like a joke until it ruins someone's season. The notary was a woman named Frances Bell, 62, scrupulous, church-going, and deeply offended by incompetence. She called Ruth back because 6 weeks earlier Cole had sent over a signature package involving a temporary delegation page for me. Not a full-power instrument. Something softer. Limited authority for event and donor continuity during a period of bereavement-related incapacity. Frances had refused to stamp it because the signature line had come to her already signed and without proper witness sequence. Ruth asked if she still had the rejected packet. Frances did. People with good habits save the strangest forms of salvation. The page was not enough on its own to convict anyone of much. But it told the story we needed. Someone had already drafted language treating my grief as capacity drift. Someone had already tried to create paper that would let Vivian and Cole speak in my place if the room became sympathetic enough. And, most importantly, they had been sloppy. My middle initial was wrong. Margaret would have noticed it at once. So would I. But grief gambling relies on the assumption that the target is too tired to read closely and everyone else is too embarrassed to ask. Ruth slid the rejected packet across my desk and said, "They're not just making a play for land. They're building backup routes in case the first lie doesn't take." That changed how I behaved around them. Until then I had been acting tired. After that I became selectively uncertain. When Vivian mentioned a donor schedule, I asked whether I had already approved the revised seating chart. When Cole referred to next quarter planning, I made him repeat the timeline twice as though I had lost track. I let one board member explain a governance clause I had written myself and thanked him for clarifying. The humiliation of that still stings a little. Good. Useful things should cost something. Because every time I seemed slightly less sharp, they relaxed a little more. Vivian started forwarding messages to herself from the office under the pretense of helping. Cole began discussing risk containment in front of Marlene as if she were decorative. One donor later told me he had privately reassured her the estate would soon have younger hands on the wheel whether or not I felt ready to announce it. Whether or not. As if my consent were a mood issue. Lucy suffered most in that stretch. She was old enough to understand exactly what her parents were doing and still young enough to hope there might be one explanation cleaner than the others. Twice she came to me with questions phrased as guesses. Once she asked whether I thought a memorial could ethically include a future vision announcement if the future vision contradicted existing donor restrictions. That is not how innocent people ask about flowers. Another time she stood in a lower greenhouse pretending to study irrigation pipes and said, if someone used a family death to pressure governance, would that count as fraud or just being awful? I said, both, usually. One is harder to prove. She pressed her lips together and nodded. A day later she brought me a thumb drive with 3 earlier render packages and a calendar export showing that the so-called Memorial Gala reveal was internally labeled launch sequence in Cole's project folder 2 weeks before Margaret died. 2 weeks before. Not after the memorial idea evolved. Before. They had started converting the room in their minds while he was still alive upstairs. I kept that knowledge to myself for exactly 6 hours before I had to go outside and walk the donor path twice in hard shoes just to spend enough anger to remain useful. By then the ballroom planning had become its own little war of symbols. Cole wanted the stage moved deeper into the room so the projection wall could dominate the sight line. I insisted on keeping Margaret's portrait at left center. Vivian wanted sleek white florals and minimal greenery because she said overgrown arrangements distracted from visual messaging. Miriam heard that sentence and nearly resigned on principle. Instead she produced memorial centerpieces so lush and unruly they looked like grief had climbed out of the soil armed. You cannot stop a daughter from lying, she told me while wiring Jasmine into a table piece, but you can make her do it in front of flowers that disapprove. Marlene became our quiet internal recorder. Not with devices. With memory. Who said what? When? To whom? Which donors received pre-read language? Which board members got private reassurance calls? Which staff were asked to route concerns to Vivian instead of me? By the second week of September, Marlene's notebook was more useful than most corporate compliance systems I have ever seen. She kept it in a biscuit tin under the reception desk because, in her words, men like Cole never look under tins that do not imply whiskey. The lender pressure sharpened things further. Dennis confirmed the bridge note maturity date. He also confirmed that Cole had personally guaranteed more of it than Vivian realized. That mattered because it meant he could not endure delay gracefully. Delay would not merely embarrass him. It would reach into his private life. And men whose private debt begins pressing on their public performance rarely choose humility. They choose speed. Sure enough, the donor room intensified. Private coffees. Off-record walkthroughs. Language about preserving Margaret's spirit by ensuring the estate could carry itself. Language about freeing me from institutional burden. Language about empowering the next generation. Always the same structure. Sentiment first. Capture second. Receipts later if necessary. One afternoon I walked into the library and found Vivian on the phone saying, no, she'll make a small remark and then I'll take the room from there. She turned when she saw me, smiled instantly, and said into the receiver, I'm with her now. The call ended. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I asked, take the room where? She did not blush. I almost admired that. She only said, "Dad, we need a clean narrative or people will invent worse ones." There are people who still believe narrative is what follows events. Those people should never marry into money. In families like mine, narrative is what people build early when they hope to make events submit. So I let her keep building hers. I let the gala invitations go out. I let the seating chart harden. I let the projection tests proceed. I let them choose the unveiling music. I let Cole book a lender into the second row as if applause itself could serve as collateral. Because by then we had the recording. The rejected authority page. The county inquiry. The entity trail. The lender exposure. The donor decks. The render histories. The meeting requests. The witness notes. The parcel trap. And one other thing that mattered more than any of them in the end. I had stopped hoping they would pull back on their own. Once that hope dies, strategy gets cleaner. That was our life for 9 days. Documents by day. Rehearsal by night. Lucy feeding us small things. Which donor decks were circulating? Which renderings were shown privately? Who had been invited to the gala with special seating? Which florist Cole had overruled because the room needed cleaner lines for projections? Even that annoyed me. Margaret hated clean lines in memorial spaces. She said grief needed somewhere to catch. Dennis handled the money. By August 21st he had enough to confirm what Ruth suspected. Cole's bridge note came due 2 weeks after the gala. Without a secured commitment from at least 3 named donor investors and evidence of governance transfer, he would have to refinance from a position of weakness or sell out his own interest at a loss. He's not just greedy, Dennis said. He's pressured. Pressure makes people stupid. Useful people, but stupid. The final piece came from Marlene, though she never knew she gave it. We were standing beside the school bus lane after a children's butterfly workshop when she said, in the tone of a woman mentioning weather, "Charles tells me Cole has been awfully interested in whether the board can move quickly if you're unwell." I looked at her. Did Charles use the word unwell? No. Cole did. Charles looked like he wanted to vanish into his loafers. There it was. Not just concern. Contingency. If the gala did not go perfectly, they were prepared to rout around me through sympathetic panic. That was when we changed the plan. Not the outcome. The order. Originally Ruth wanted the deeds and reversion notices ready to file the morning after the gala, once Vivian and Cole had fully committed on stage. After Marlene's comment, we moved faster. Parcel C transferred under notice to the Hart Educational Trust 22 days before the gala. Quietly. Legally. Completely. No announcement. No warning. No whisper to donors. No courtesy to blood relatives who had already mistaken my restraint for permission. When I signed the activation packet in Ruth's office, she slid the pages across one at a time and said, "Once I send this to County and Trust Council, the East grounds are functionally beyond their reach unless they can reverse the underlying covenants." Can they? Not unless you and Margaret were idiots. We weren't. Then sign. So I did. With each page, I felt less like a widower and more like the man I had been before people started lowering their voices around me. That did not heal anything. But it returned my spine to me. By the time September arrived, Hart House looked exactly the way betrayal likes its settings. Perfect. The lawns cut short. The fountain repaired. The donor tents ordered. The ballroom relit. Margaret's portrait cleaned and rehung above the west stair. Vivian moved through the house like a curator of her own future. Cole carried folders and spoke in low urgent bursts about seating charts, investment timing, and message discipline. Message discipline. Imagine trying to package a dead horticulturalist like a hospitality brand and still using the word discipline without hearing your own villainy echo. I watched them for days. How Vivian practiced her pause before saying my father. How Cole rehearsed gratitude in mirrors. How they treated longtime staff as if continuity were something they had invented. And all the while, the land under their Phase 1 rendering no longer belonged to the arrangement they thought they controlled. That alone would have been enough to defeat the project. But defeat was not what I wanted anymore. I wanted completion. I wanted every lie connected to the next one so that when the floor finally gave way beneath them, there would be no generous little version left for the town to hold on to later. The afternoon of the gala, I spent an hour in Margaret's sitting room on the second floor, the one overlooking the south lawn where she used to fasten pearl earrings in front of a mirror too small for comfort and refuse every suggestion I ever made about replacing it because, in her words, a person who cannot prepare around inconvenience deserves to look foolish. Her small silver bracelet was still in the top drawer. Her fountain pen was still in the tray beside the old silver brush. A pressed ginkgo leaf tucked into the corner of the mirror frame from some autumn volunteer day years ago. Grief does not always arrive as weeping. Sometimes it is the fact that a drawer still understands a person better than a room full of mourners ever will. I sat in the chair by the window and listened to the setup below. Vans arriving. Tent poles clanking. Staff calling for extension cords. Lucy downstairs arguing quietly with the lighting contractor because the projection screen was blocking too much of the original mural. Good girl. Even in a siege she still defended aesthetics honestly. At 4, Ruth came up with the final packet. Copies for County Council. Copies for Dana Morrow from the Attorney General's Charitable Division, who had agreed to attend privately after Ruth showed her just enough to make curiosity feel irresponsible. Copies for Charles from the bank. Copies for Marlene. Copies for the original donor trustees. And one sealed envelope for Cole's lender, whose representative would be seated at table 9 under the impression he was about to witness a secure family transition instead of a controlled demolition. Any second thoughts? Ruth asked. About the land. No. About Vivian. I thought about that. Not dramatically. Not like a father in a film deciding whether to destroy her child. More like a man checking whether mercy had any factual basis left. If she had come to me in June and said, I am frightened, I am greedy, I am being pushed by a husband with debt, and I need help before I do something unforgivable, I would have burned half my own comfort to save her. Ruth nodded. But she came with renderings. Yes. Then no, Thomas. I don't think you have second thoughts. I think you have leftover sorrow confusing itself with duty. That was accurate enough to hurt. The day of the gala arrived with one of those deceptive autumn skies that make old stone look as if it has chosen immortality on purpose. Blue above. Gold in the trees. Cold enough by late afternoon that everyone suddenly remembers coats and mortality at once. I woke before dawn and lay still for almost half an hour listening to Harthouse breathe. Boiler ticks. Pipes settling. Wind along the west eaves. A truck on the county road. Nothing mystical. That is the point. Places worth defending never announce themselves with violins. They ask for ordinary attention over very long periods of time. By 6:30 I was downstairs in the kitchen wearing one of my old wool sweaters over my shirt because grief, like winter, makes thieves of body heat. Marlene was already there. She had coffee on and a face that said she had slept badly out of loyalty. How bad does it look? I asked. Publicly or morally? Both. Publicly, expensive. Morally, tasteless. There are uplights in the ballroom. I closed my eyes. Margaret hated uplights. Said they made every room look as if it was trying to sell itself to a dentist. Marlene handed me coffee and a folder. Inside were the final seating placements, revised one last time at midnight after Cole decided a regional lender needed clearer sight lines to the stage and an elderly donor widow with actual long-term history could therefore be moved 3 tables back. That alone told me the evening had stopped being memorial even in the logistics. Real mourning moves elders closer. Salesmanship moves capital closer. I dressed more carefully than Vivian expected. Black suit. Polished black shoes. The silver watch Margaret liked because it made me look, in her words, as if common sense had learned punctuality. I wore her wedding band on the chain under my shirt and the county trust key in the inner pocket of my jacket, not because I needed the key for anything practical, but because objects help at threshold moments. They remind the body what side it is on. Ruth arrived at 10 with 2 garment bags, a legal pad, and the kind of cheerfulness she reserves for funerals, trials, and other events where hypocrisy will soon be forced to improvise. One bag held her own suit. The other held a backup black jacket for me in case someone spilled something strategically. She did not say that part out loud. She did not need to. Dennis and Aaron took over the old records room just after lunch. Cables. Backups. Playback checks. The raw hospice file on 2 separate drives. The trimmed clip on a dedicated playback path. A print packet sealed and ready if technology failed. I approved every version myself because if there is one lesson age teaches, it is that vengeance should never rely on exactly one device. Lucy came by in the early afternoon under the pretense of checking table plantings. She looked pale and furious in alternating waves. Her mother had placed her at a donor table between a museum patron and a boutique hotel widow because, as Vivian put it in one email we intercepted, Lucy's youth softens perception of continuity. I still do not know whether that sentence belongs more in a branding manual or a charge sheet. Do I stay in the room when it happens? Lucy asked. Yes. Are you sure? No, I said. But yes. She stood by the window with both arms folded. I keep thinking maybe she'll stop at the last minute. Why? Because she has to know you know something by now. People like your mother often mistake resistance for emotional weather, I said. If they can explain your silence as fatigue, they do. Lucy nodded and stared out at the east meadow. I hate that I still want her to choose the less disgusting version. So do I. We left it there because the afternoon was not built for the larger sadness yet. There would be time for that later. Or not. Families do not heal on schedule just because a script needs them to. By 3 o'clock the vendors had fully occupied the house. Florals at the stairs. Microphone tests in the ballroom. Tray passes being counted in the service hall. A string quartet warming up near the long gallery with all the sincerity in the world and no idea they were tuning for a near execution. Cole moved through the rooms like a man already being photographed by the future. Dark blue suit. Silver tie. Pocket square folded with the kind of accuracy I distrust on principle. He carried no visible notes. That was deliberate. He wanted every person who saw him to believe the night lived naturally inside him. He stopped me near the ballroom arch and offered his arm. That almost made me laugh. I thought perhaps I'd walk you in, he said. To my own house. To the event. Those are not always the same thing, I said. He smiled, but his eyes checked my face too quickly after. He was still taking readings. Was I trembling? Was I glassy? Would the widower perform instability on schedule? He had built too much around the answer being yes. Big night, he said. For whom? He held the smile. I think Margaret would be pleased to see the room so full. That line annoyed me more than the others because he had never understood Margaret's relationship to rooms. Margaret did not care whether a room was full. He cared whether the people in it left with some obligation to one another heavier than when they entered. I looked past Cole into the ballroom. The chandeliers were dimmed lower than I would ever have allowed. The projection wall glowed softly with a sepia image of Hart House at dusk. Tables set in cream linen. Silver polished too brightly. Tall arrangements Miriam had fought to make asymmetrical and alive despite Vivian's preference for clean vertical lines that photographed well and felt like expensive throat clearing in person. The orchestra tucked too neatly in the far alcove. The stage extended farther into the room than the permit sketch had shown. And there, in the second row center, a chair had been shifted. Not much. Maybe 14 inches. But enough to change the sight line. Enough to move me from the direct center of witness into the sympathetic offset position reserved for grieving relatives who are not expected to interrupt the strategic child. I almost admired the precision. Power announces itself in inches long before it reaches microphones. I walked into the ballroom without taking Cole's arm and moved the chair back myself. Slowly. Not dramatically. Just enough that 3 people saw it and pretended not to. Good. Witnesses like that are useful later. They are embarrassed to admit how much they noticed, which usually means they tell the truth once asked directly. By 5:30 the guests began arriving in full earnest. The town's cultured half. The donor class. Former interns grown into attorneys and orthopedic surgeons. Bored spouses who mistook attendance for stewardship. Teachers who genuinely loved Margaret and would have attended in boots if necessary. A lender with expensive loafers and the face of a man who has never once mistaken sentiment for underwriting. 3 preservation women from Philadelphia who came wearing the expression of people prepared to be morally moved as long as the room also validated their scarves. And in among them, the ordinary loyalists who mattered more. Volunteers. Garden Society women. Parents of former scholarship kids. People who still remembered when Hart House had one leaking gutter and no vanity around its leaks. Every room told the story differently. The donors saw legacy and transition. The staff saw trespass. The volunteers smelled something wrong but lacked paperwork. The town saw memorial. Cole saw capital. Vivian saw replacement. I saw timing. People greeted me with the softness widowers attract and I used it. I let them hold my hands. Let them say Margaret's name. Let them mention how brave I had been. I answered quietly and gave none of them enough material to classify me as either broken or combative. That balance matters. If you are too composed, people resent the failure to satisfy their image of loss. Too emotional, and ambitious relatives start whispering capacity. So I gave them a widower's middle register. Tired, kind, watchful, impossible to route neatly into any later story except the true one. At 6:10, Charles Hensley approached with a glass he had not yet started drinking and asked whether I felt up to saying a few words before Vivian took the room into the forward-looking piece. Forward-looking. They had actually trained him. I feel up to hearing all the words first, I said. He blanched a little, which told me he had not realized quite how much of the architecture had already become visible from my seat. At 6:25, Father James arrived late as always, carrying a scarf like a surrender flag and muttering that memorial valet arrangements were the final proof civilization had gone unshepherded. I kissed his cheek and whispered, "If I ask you to stall the room for 90 seconds later, can you?" He said, "For justice or for style?" "Both." "Then I may exceed 90. Useful man." At 6:32, Aaron signaled from the records room that the projector path had been mirrored and protected. At 6:37, Dennis signaled that the lender had spent 11 minutes in a corner with Cole and emerged neither alarmed nor fully convinced. Good. Ambition works hardest right before certainty hardens. At 6:41, Marlene whispered that Vivian had swapped the printed order of remarks so that my supposed blessing appeared before the reveal rather than after it. Also good. Any person who rearranges sequence that late is managing nerves, not merely aesthetics. By 7 the room was full enough to hum. Glass. Linen. Low speech. Silverware. The orchestra finding tone. 100 small private memories of Margaret moving through the room and getting tangled with a development scheme she would have despised. I took my seat. Ruth 3 chairs to my left. Lucy at table 7 with a spine so straight it looked architectural. Miriam near the back where she could leave quickly if someone insulted a perennial. Father James in a side aisle seat because he hates being trapped by wealthy knees. The lender in second row center. Charles at table 1 trying to appear neutral and instead looking like a man at his own tax audit. Cole just off stage. Vivian at the podium, notes in hand though she barely glanced at them. She had rehearsed this enough to bleed from it if needed. Then the lights dropped. I want you to understand something about rooms at moments like that. They do not go silent instantly. They rearrange themselves into readiness. Chairs settle. People fold hands. Glasses touch linen. The last whispers move like fish through reeds and vanish. Expectation takes shape before sound does. Vivian began beautifully. Of course she did. She talked about Margaret's generosity. Her laugh. Her belief in public beauty. The way Harthouse had taught generations that land could educate as well as impress. Every line was true enough to lower defenses. That was her gift. She never lied clumsily when a better strategy existed. She braided truth until people forgot to ask what had been tied to it. Then she turned the braid. She spoke about burden. About seasons. About how those who love institutions most must sometimes release them into more sustainable hands. She said grief had clarified things for me. She said in her final weeks Margaret had spoken often about evolution rather than preservation, about relieving me of weight, about allowing the next generation to protect the estate in ways appropriate to the century. That last phrase made 2 preservation women nod, which I still resent on aesthetic grounds. Then came my supposed role in it. My father, Thomas, who has carried Harthouse with extraordinary devotion. The room turned gently toward me. Exactly as planned. Widower as prelude. Witness as scenery. Vivian smiled. Trembled in the voice at exactly the correct syllable. Cole moved just enough at the wings to suggest protective readiness. And then she said the line about me stepping aside, about Mom wanting it, about the memorial gala becoming the moment we welcomed Harthouse into its next chapter. The projection changed behind her. Renderings. Amber windows. Private courtyards. Stone lines in the meadow. Parcel C lit like opportunity. I felt the entire room take the bait at once. Not fully. Rooms this old contain enough conscience to resist for a second. But almost. Enough applause rose fast enough that the slower, better people were carried a few beats with it before thought caught up. That was the exact moment I stood. Not earlier. Not during the first lie. Not when burden was said. Not when the chair had been moved. At the rendering. At the visual theft. Because once land is pictured as sold, language alone sounds defensive in reply. People needed the counterweight of fact and voice together. My knees hurt. My chest hurt. I missed Margaret so much in that second I could taste metal. And still I stood. Across the room I saw Vivian register it. Shock first. Then annoyance. Then calculation. Could she pivot? Could she absorb? Could the widower be folded into the scene rather than allowed to puncture it? I did not hurry. Hurry would have helped them. I walked to the aisle, then to the front, hearing the room change behind me. Whispers now. Not applause. Whispers. At the stage stairs Cole moved as if to assist me. I said, quietly enough that only he heard, "Do not touch me in my own ambush." He stepped back. The first honest instinct of the night. At the podium Vivian whispered, "Dad, maybe let me finish this part." I took the microphone from the stand and said, "No. One syllable. That is all some rooms need. Not volume. Position." And because Father James is a vulgar little saint when required, he stood in the side aisle at exactly that moment and said in a carrying voice, "I think we can all afford the widower another minute." The room laughed. Lightly. Uneasily. Enough to reset the hierarchy. Not donor event. Not launch. Suddenly family truth in public. Very different marketplace. I looked out over the ballroom and saw, with perfect miserable clarity, exactly what they had built and exactly why it was about to fail. By 6:30 the house had filled. The memorial gala always used to be our warmest event. Not flashy. Candlelight, chamber music, school children's pressed flower displays in the hallway, teachers and trustees and old donors mingling with volunteers in shoes that had known real weather. Margaret believed money behaved better when made to share tables with people who actually cared about the mission. Vivian had changed the proportions. More uplighting. Fewer school displays. Long mirrored bars on either side of the ballroom. A giant projection system. Sleeker floral work. Smaller place cards. Bigger sponsor fonts. No memory table for gardeners. No display of Margaret's notebooks. No volunteer board from the 70s. Even grief had been rebranded. I moved through the reception as if none of that registered. Widowers become invisible in useful ways if they keep their shoulders low and their answers short. People patted my hand. Told me Margaret would be proud. Told me Vivian had been magnificent. Told me how brave it was to let the next generation carry the torch. I thanked them all. The trick, I discovered, was not to lie. Margaret would indeed have been proud of some of them. Vivian had indeed worked hard. Bravery was in the room. Just not in the people they meant. At 7:15, Cole stopped me beside the donor wall and said, "Thomas, just a practical note. Because the program is tight tonight, once Vivian does the transition announcement, we'll move quickly into the film, then investor remarks, then dinner. It would help if your response stays personal rather than administrative." There it was. Stay personal. Stay soft. Stay decorative. I looked up at him. He was taller than me by nearly a foot and had spent the last 3 months assuming that height and confidence naturally made him the adult in every room. "Of course," I said. "Wouldn't want facts to make the evening feel crowded." He smiled because contempt often slips past men who hear only compliance. "Exactly." Lucy found me 10 minutes later in the side corridor near the old cloakroom. "Grandpa," she whispered, "Mom moved your seat." I noticed. She looked stricken. I didn't know she would actually do that. I touched her wrist. "Lucy, breathe. I want to leave." "No. I need you to stay." "For what?" "To see what people become when the room stops cooperating with them." She stared at me a second longer, then nodded. There was fear in her face, but not the kind that weakens. The kind that learns. At 7:30, the ballroom doors closed. The quartet finished the opening movement. The first course arrived. The lights lowered. A brief film of Margaret played, built mostly from public footage, spring tours, children's programs, her laugh beside the koi pond, her hands in the soil, her ridiculous straw hat, her face lighting up over seed catalogs like some people light up over sports cars. It was well edited. I will give Vivian that. She knew how to build affection on a screen. Then she took the podium. And we arrive again where I began. The speech. The applause. The announcement. My missing place card. The rendering. The invitation to say a few words. Only now you know what sat beneath that moment. The forged authorization. The shell debt. The edited hospice clip. The transferred parcel. The old covenants. The private debt note depending on the public sale of grief. So when I stood at that podium and asked for Margaret's last full instruction to be played, I was not improvising. I was opening the trap with my own hand. The screen lit slowly. No montage. No music. Just Margaret in bed, thinner than anyone in the room wanted to remember her, sunlight across the blanket, her voice weak but intact. A hush moved through the ballroom immediately, the genuine kind, not the performative hush of speeches. She said the line Vivian had counted on. At some point Thomas will have to decide what is too much for him. I heard chairs shift as relief began to rise in the front donor tables. Then the clip continued. Margaret went on talking. About labor. About public trust. About the danger of people mistaking beauty for inventory. He said the land was not to be sold in pieces. He said I was to stop anyone who tried. He said he knew Vivian loved beauty but not always its obligations. And then, looking toward whoever held the phone, he said, clearly enough that even the waitstaff in the doorway stiffened, do not turn my death into a package. The room did not gasp. Real shock is usually quieter than theater. It was the silence that changed. Before, it had been reverent. Now it was listening. I let the clip end fully. No one moved. Then I said, my daughter quoted one sentence from that recording several times this summer. I thought you deserved the rest. Vivian rose halfway from her seat. Dad, this is cruel. Cruel would have been letting you keep using the short version. Cole stood too. Not fully, not enough to look aggressive, just enough to project management. Thomas, perhaps we should move this conversation private. You staged it public. We will finish it public. I have no memory of deciding to say that line. It simply arrived, and once it arrived the room belonged to me again. Ruth stepped forward from the side aisle carrying folders. Dana Morrow stood too, though most of the donors did not yet know who she was. Marlene folded her napkin and set it down with a deliberateness I will love until I die. I turned one page at the podium and continued. For those of you who serve on this board, or have given money to this institution under the explicit understanding that the East Grounds remain public educational land, you should know that Mercer Living Partners was formed 6 months before my wife died. You should also know that preliminary debt was taken against development fees linked to a private residential conversion that our governing documents do not permit. This time the room did react. A murmur. Short. Ugly. Cole tried to laugh. That's simply false. Ruth answered from the aisle before I had to. It is documented. She began handing packets to table captains the way some women pass bread. Dana followed with copies for the board. Charles Fenwick did not open his immediately. He stared at Cole first, banker face falling into that special expression money men get when the story in front of them suddenly explains several small discomforts at once. Vivian stepped toward the stage. Dad, you've been misled. These are preliminary structures. Nothing binding has happened. Your shell borrowed $180,000 against Phase 1 development assumptions, I said. That is binding enough for a man who cannot cover it without this room. Her face emptied for 1 second. Just one. Enough. Then came back hotter. You went through our finances. You built a private development structure around public land and my wife's funeral. You do not get to say our. Cole took the microphone stand with one hand as if proximity to equipment might restore authority. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice smooth again, what you're seeing is grief expressed as suspicion. Thomas is understandably overwhelmed. Vivian and I have only tried to help stabilize a beloved institution in a difficult moment. There it was. The concerned turn. The soft path to my incompetence. I had waited for it all summer. So I answered exactly the way Ruth trained me. Then why forge my initials? I held up the page. Not dramatically. Just long enough for the front tables to see. Then Dana said, very clearly from where she stood, my office would also like to know the answer to that. This time the room truly shifted. Because when a quiet woman with a state badge says my office in a ballroom full of donors, people start separating themselves from the wrong tables. Vivian turned toward Dana. Who are you? Dana Morrow. Charitable oversight. I attended tonight because certain governance documents raised questions. Those questions are multiplying. Cole pulled his hand off the podium. I have always believed the body reveals collapse before the face does. His hand knew first. He began again, but faster now. No one forged anything. Thomas gave informal assent to early modeling. We were trying to save this place from sentimental paralysis. By putting private cottages in the school greenhouse, Marlene said. By moving my seat before the soup course, I added. Father James, bless him, said into the silence, that was tacky even before the probable fraud. A few people laughed. That ended Cole more than anger would have. Mockery is fatal to men who trade on confidence. Vivian moved closer to the stage, eyes bright now, all performance gone. Do you have any idea what it costs to keep this place standing? She demanded. You and Mom built a fantasy on goodwill and dead donors. The world changed. People don't fund mosques and school buses forever. We needed a model that could survive. There it was. At last. Not heritage. Not stewardship. Contempt. For children. For volunteers. For the very public that had made Hart House matter. You did not build a survival model, I said. You built a private revenue stream under a memorial banner. And what if we did? She snapped. What was I supposed to inherit? A drafty house, a donor list, and your endless rules. Mom left all the sentiment to me and all the control to you. I was done waiting for permission. The room inhaled as one body. There are moments when a lie stops needing exposure because the liar has fallen in love with the relief of saying it out loud. Vivian kept going. You think public trust is holy because it lets you feel superior. Mom adored this place, but he also let it consume everything. Our holidays. Our money. Our attention. Every school district crisis, every burst pipe, every volunteer with a sad face, it all came before us. You want to know why I used the short clip? Because the long version was just more of the same. More land. More obligation. More of you two asking everyone else to worship maintenance. I looked at her across the stage lights and for one instant I saw the little girl arranging teacups in the nursery window as if dolls were an audience and she alone knew how the play should go. Then that image passed. In its place stood the woman who had edited a dying man's warning into permission and called it pragmatism. You were never asked to worship maintenance, I said. You were asked not to sell what other people paid to keep public. Then I turned to the board. 22 days ago, under the reversion language attached to Parcel C, I transferred the East Grounds, Lower Greenhouse Strip, Donor Walk, and Orchard into the Hart Educational Trust after legal notice that private residential conversion was being pursued through an unauthorized related party entity. Those grounds are no longer available to any Mercer project, concept, residency model, or whatever sweater Mr. Mercer would like to put on a condo tomorrow morning. That was the blow. Not loud. Final. Charles opened his packet then. Fast. The lender's representative at table 9 took out his phone without even pretending courtesy anymore. Cole went pale in a way expensive men always think only poor people can see. You can't do that retroactively, he said. I already did it prospectively, I replied. Ruth, from the aisle, added, County acknowledged receipt at 10:14 a.m. 3 weeks ago. The lender's representative was already walking toward the hallway. Cole saw him and actually left the room for 1/2 second before remembering that running in formal shoes looks exactly like guilt. When he turned back, his face had changed. Not broken yet. Calculating under open flame. "Vivian," he said sharply, as if this were suddenly an internal matter. She looked at him and knew in that instant what I had known for weeks. He had spent money he never had. On land he never controlled. In a room now turning against him in real time. Lucy stood from the side table near the windows. She had not been meant to speak. That is why what she said mattered. "Mom told me this project was for fellows and artists," she said, her voice shaking but carrying. "The renderings I saw had private pools and guest parking over the orchard. She told me Grandma wanted modern stewardship. She didn't. She told all of us something else. We just didn't all listen equally." Vivian whipped toward her. "Lucy, sit down." Lucy did not. "No," she said. "I'm done helping you make pretty language for ugly things. I will carry that sentence with me to my grave. Not because it saved the evening. Because it saved her." Cole tried one last pivot. "Even if Thomas has activated some old trust mechanism, the board still has authority to evaluate strategic use across the remaining campus. Tonight should not become a referendum on one parcel transfer." Dana closed that door for him. "Tonight is already a referendum on governance integrity," she said. "And tomorrow morning my office will want every communication, draft, entity filing, and donor deck associated with Mercer Living Partners." Ruth added, almost cheerfully, including the forged authorization page. Then Charles, who had been too slow all summer and knew it, finally found a spine. He stood and said, "As board treasurer, I move that all strategic authority discussions be frozen pending independent review, that no family member holding undisclosed related party interests participate in interim governance, and that Mercer Living Partners be barred from further representation of Hart House until council completes an immediate audit." Marlene said, "Second." Father James said, "Third, if we're collecting sins." The room laughed again, but this time the laughter did not belong to Cole. Vivian looked at me with a face I had seen only once before, when she was 12 and learned I had read the letter she forged from a music teacher about a competition she hadn't actually won. It was not shame. It was outrage that reality had refused her arrangement. "You planned this," she said. "No," I answered. "You planned this. I documented it. There is a difference." Ruth handled the formal vote because at that point my speaking any longer would have looked theatrical. She moved with the precision of a woman who had spent her life waiting for exactly this quality of hypocrisy to step into good lighting. The board voted. The freeze passed unanimously. The audit passed. Temporary removal of Vivian from any acting governance role passed with only Father James hesitating long enough to mutter, "Lord forgive us for raising children into PowerPoints." People began leaving their seats. Not rushing. That is not how respectable rooms fall apart. They fragment by table. A donor couple here deciding they suddenly have an early morning. A trustee there whispering for a copy of the covenants. A banker in the hallway returning from a call with a face like wet plaster. The quartet, uncertain whether to play, settled on silence and never recovered. The waitstaff kept moving because professionals understand that endings still require glassware. I stepped away from the podium then. My knees were weaker than I wanted. Not from doubt. From age and adrenaline and the fact that public composure costs the body later. Lucy reached me first. "Grandpa." I touched her cheek. "You stayed standing. Good." Then I saw Vivian coming toward us through the thinning room. Not daughterly now. No performance. No softness. Just fury in heels. "You humiliated me," she said. You scheduled my humiliation before dessert. You could have done this privately. So could you. In June. Before the shell company. Before the forged initials. Before the edited clip. Before my seat disappeared. For 1 second I thought she might slap me. Not because she was wild. Because some people, when language fails them, look for older tools. She did not. Instead she looked toward the screen where Margaret's still image had returned, then back at me. He chose you over me even dying, she said. There are accusations so childish they come wrapped around a truth too damaged to use. I answered carefully. No, Vivian. He trusted me with the part he knew you might someday betray. That is not the same thing. Her face broke then. Not into remorse. Into something almost more unsettling. Exhaustion. As if somewhere deep beneath the ambition she had always believed that if she just got control fast enough, if she arranged the room perfectly enough, if she turned the estate into numbers before grief became memory, she could finally stop feeling second to a place. That realization did not soften me. It only made the tragedy more specific. Cole never came back into the ballroom. He left through the west corridor after his call with the lender and drove away before the coffee service ended. That detail pleased me more than it should have. Men like him deserve at least one public exit they cannot style into strategy later. By 10:30, the room was nearly empty. The flowers still looked expensive. The salmon had gone cold. Margaret's portrait watched over a battlefield composed mostly of untouched dessert forks and donor packets. I stood alone for a moment in the center of the ballroom after the last board member left. Ruth came to my side. Well, she said, looking around, that could not have gone much cleaner without divine handwriting on the ceiling. I laughed then. First real laugh in months. It hurt. Good laughter after grief often does. Dana approached with 2 folders under her arm. My office will open a formal review in the morning, she said. I don't know yet whether it ends in civil action, governance penalties, or criminal referral. But I do know this. You were right not to let tonight pass as a family misunderstanding. I thanked her. She nodded once and left. What happened in the ballroom after the screen went black and Margaret's real words finished filling the room did not look like cinematic justice. It looked like expensive people suddenly remembering they had bodies. Chairs scraped. Water glasses were reached for. 3 donors stared stubbornly at their programs as if typography might restore order. Someone near the back whispered, "Play that again," in the tone people use when they do not yet understand whether they have been moved or defrauded. The quartet stopped pretending to be invisible. One violinist actually lowered her instrument and looked at Cole with the frank moral confusion only musicians and children permit themselves in formal rooms. Vivian recovered first, or thought she did. That was always one of her strengths. Not honesty. Recovery. She stepped back toward the microphone and said, with remarkable poise for a woman who had just watched her husband and her own ambition burn together on a projection wall, I think perhaps there has been a misunderstanding about what this concept work represented. Misunderstanding. That beloved refuge of people caught with a plan in daylight. I did not move from the podium. Then I suggest you explain why the county was asked whether automatic deed reversion could be delayed after a public continuity announcement. The room made a sound then. Not loud. But collective. The sound groups make when the problem has shifted from family drama to documentable wrongdoing. Cole came forward from the wing because men like him always believe the room can still be won by a stronger tie knot and better diction. Thomas, he said, using my first name now because pretense had thinned, this is neither the time nor the format for partial legal interpretations. Tonight was meant to honor Margaret. Then it was poorly designed from the start, I said. Because you built the honor around private occupancy models on land you do not control. A banker in the second row stood up then. Not the lender himself. A donor banker with old discretion and no patience for public exposure risk. Do we understand correctly, he asked into the room rather than to me, that financing may have been structured on representations inconsistent with trust restrictions? That was the moment money officially stopped being polite. Cole heard it too. You could see the exact second his skin understood what his face was trying to hide. Family scandal he could maybe survive. A room full of witnesses hearing lender language. Much worse. There is no financing issue, he said too quickly. Dennis, from the side aisle where he had moved closer without my noticing, said, that would be news to Commonwealth Regional. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. People with facts rarely do. Vivian turned toward him sharply. What are you doing here? Protecting math from theater, Dennis said. Ruth was already moving. Not toward the stage. Toward the donor tables. That was why I wanted her there. Law happens in motions and letters. Collapse happens in conversations before the valet stand. She spoke first to the 3 oldest charter donors, then to the museum widow, then to Charles, then to a school superintendent who had brought his wife because he believed the night would be sentimental and safe. Ruth's gift is not persuasion. It is dignified contagion. Once she starts speaking, the truth begins spreading through a room by social metabolism. Meanwhile, Miriam did something I did not ask for and will always love her for. She instructed the servers to keep pouring coffee. That sounds small. It was not. Nothing destabilizes a false unveiling like forcing the room to transition from champagne mood into practical beverage logic. Coffee says stay. Coffee says observe. Coffee says we are not rushing off to let the beautiful liars retell this elsewhere first. Father James took the opposite role. He drifted among the older town people collecting their first reactions with all the shamelessness of a parish priest who knows gossip becomes witness if you write it down fast enough. Lucy remained seated for nearly 2 full minutes after the reveal collapsed. I watched her across the room. Still. Hands flat on the tablecloth. Eyes on her mother. She looked not devastated exactly. Something sadder. Like a person watching the final version of an old private fear become public architecture. Then she stood and crossed the ballroom slowly. Not to me. To Vivian. I could not hear the first line. Only the second. Lucy said, very clearly, you used Grandma's death like branding. A silence followed that sentence larger than any applause Cole had hoped to harvest. Because of all the accusations in the room, that was the one no donor could safely reframe as technical disagreement. Branding. Everyone there understood branding. And nobody wanted to be caught underwriting it with a widower in the front row. Vivian hissed something back. Lucy shook her head once. Then she did the bravest clean thing of the night besides the screen itself. She turned to 3 donors at the nearest table and said, the renderings were never educational fellow housing. The first drafts had plunge pools. 2 of the donors stared at her. The third, God bless old women with receipts in their marrow, said, I knew it looked too moisturized. That nearly broke the room into laughter. Nearly. The difference between scandal and farce is often one brave older person refusing to be solemn on behalf of nonsense. Cole tried again. Of course he did. He asked for calm. He asked everyone to recognize that visionary stewardship often requires early concept modeling. He said no final legal action had occurred. He said grief had clearly produced emotional sensitivity around change and perhaps the family should continue this conversation privately. Privately. There it was. The emergency shelter of people losing in public. No, I said into the microphone. Privacy built this problem. Witnesses are doing excellent work. The lender finally stood. Tall man. Gray suit. No visible sentiment whatsoever. He did not address me first. He addressed Cole. Have you or have you not represented site availability beyond your actual secured authority? Cole began, we have explored. The lender cut him off. That is not the question. I have never loved a banker before or since, but in that instant I came very close. Cole did not answer quickly enough. Which was answer enough for any room with money in it. The lender picked up his program, folded it once with terrible neatness, and said, then this conversation is over for me tonight. He did not storm out. Real power rarely storms. It leaves. That was worse. 2 others followed within 30 seconds. Not all at once. Sequentially. Like a line of bad faith withdrawing its oxygen from the evening. Vivian saw it happening and made one last strategic error. She reached for tears too fast. I cannot believe this is how you're choosing to remember Mom, she said to me, loud enough for the room. That line might have worked if the recording had not already fixed the moral center. Instead it sounded exactly like what it was. A daughter attempting to climb back onto a dead man by claiming custody of his memory in a room that had just heard him reject her plan. Your mother is being remembered accurately for the first time tonight, I said. That is why this is going so badly for you. After that the event did not end. It frayed. Donors gathered in islands. Staff switched from event mode to institutional triage without anyone formally instructing them. Marlene began collecting printed programs because she understood, even in crisis, that false artifacts become evidence if preserved quickly. Gus positioned himself near the service corridor after noticing Cole trying to signal one of the AV contractors toward the records room. Aaron intercepted that before it mattered. Technology, like land, rewards whoever assumes sabotage first. By the time I stepped off the stage, the room had fully changed jurisdiction. No longer memorial gala. Not yet legal proceeding. Something between tribunal and wake. Charles approached me white-faced and sweating through the collar. I didn't know, he said. You knew enough to want my health discussed in subcommittee, I answered. He flinched. Good. Small men should feel history when it passes them. I believed they were trying to spare you. No, I said. You believed what was least embarrassing to believe about yourself while lending them your vote. That ended Charles for the night. And, as it turned out, for quite a while after. The immediate danger after a collapse like that is not only escape. It is narrative salvage. Who calls whom first? Who frames what is misunderstanding? Who gets to speak to press, lender, board, staff, and town before the facts settle? So we moved fast. Ruth took the board room upstairs with Dennis and locked in the 6 members still worth the air they used. Aaron duplicated the playback trail and secured the original drive. Marlene pulled access logs. Gus blocked the east service entrance with a maintenance truck in case anyone thought about removing boxes from the temporary office setup Cole had installed in the old catering room. Lucy collected every printed rendering she could find from the donor packets while wearing the expression of a girl cleaning up after a fire her parents had set decoratively. I went to Margaret's study and sat down for exactly 2 minutes with the door shut. Not because I was falling apart. Because no one should make the next set of decisions while still hearing applause recoil in their bones. The room smelled faintly of cedar, ink, and the last cologne Margaret could still wear before treatment made fragrances impossible. Her reading glasses were still on the desk. One lens smudged. There are objects after death that feel theatrical and objects that feel criminally ordinary. Her glasses fell in the second category. I touched the frame once and said out loud, to nobody visible, well. They were stupid in all the useful places. Then I got up and went back to work. The board session lasted until nearly midnight. Not because governance became noble all at once. Because self-preservation finally aligned with accuracy. Dana joined by speakerphone from her office. The county council joined half an hour later. The lender's attorney did not formally participate but left a voicemail so clipped it practically counted as litigation foreplay. Within 90 minutes the board had passed emergency resolutions preserving all records, freezing any development-related communications under Foundation authority, and suspending Vivian from interim operational access pending review. Charles abstained on one vote and voted yes on the rest with the face of a man discovering conscience only after public embarrassment. Again, not noble. Still useful. Cole tried to gain entry twice. The second time he shouted through the corridor door that delay would only deepen exposure. Ruth opened the door exactly 3 inches and told him, "Exposure is what your tie knot deserves." Then she closed it again. At 1 in the morning, when the last external guests had long since gone and only the institutional skeleton remained, Vivian found me alone in the lower hall by the portrait stair. She had removed her heels. Her makeup had begun to separate at the edges in the way faces do when a whole self-concept gets dragged several yards behind the body. For a moment she looked young. That almost made things worse. "Did you plan all of this?" she asked. "No. Don't lie to me. I am not. I planned enough of it. The rest was the natural consequence of you overreaching in front of too many people who understand deeds." She laughed once. Drained, bitter. "You always loved paper more than people." "No. I loved paper because people like you count on everyone else being too sentimental to read it." That landed. She looked away. Then, very quietly, she said, "You could have stopped this before tonight." That was the closest she came to truth all evening. Yes. I could have. I could have confronted her privately with the county inquiry. Shown her the hospice archive. Told her we knew about the note and the lender and the shell entities. Begged her to pull back. Protected her from public humiliation. Protected myself from seeing my granddaughter watch her mother fall apart in donor light. Protected the town from one ugly story after another. I could have done all of that. But she had built the harm in private. Through quiet language. Soft edits. Half signatures. Concern. Burden. Transition. If I had kept the reckoning private too, the lie would have survived in some tender family version forever. No. It had to break where she intended it to bind. So I told her the only answer that mattered. "Yes," I said. "I could have. And if you had been making a mistake, I would have. But you were making a business model." Her face changed at that. Not because the word surprised her. Because they named her accurately enough to hurt. "I was trying to save this place. You were trying to own the profitable version of what other people saved." She shook her head hard. "You don't know what it costs to run anything now. People my age do not inherit institutions. We inherit decayed obligations and guilt." At first I thought that line had come from Cole. Then I realized it was worse. It was hers. There, in the middle of the ruined evening, was the most honest argument she had. Not greed as greed. Greed as generational correction. The young telling themselves they are merely repricing what older people sentimentalized. "There are real burdens here," I said. "Roofing. Staffing. Heating. Insurance. Endowment pressure. You are not wrong about those. You are wrong about the cure. Luxury buyers would have funded everything." No. Luxury buyers would have funded the luxury buyers and left us explaining the rest in nicer stationery. She looked at me a long time. Then she said, almost in wonder, "You really chose the town over me." "No," I said. "I chose the truth over the version of you that asked me to lie down for it." That was when she started crying for real. Not stage crying. No clean face. No useful profile. Ugly, furious, private crying. The kind people do when the room no longer rewards composure. I did not move toward her. That is another thing age teaches. Not every pain deserves immediate soothing from the person it tried to bury. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said, "Cole is saying the board may be exposed too if this goes wider. Then perhaps the board should have read better and hovered less around my stamina. You don't understand. There are personal guarantees. There. At last. Not stewardship. Not mission. Not heritage. Debt. Always debt." "I know," I said. Her head came up sharply. Of course she had not realized how much we knew. That is the weakness of people who narrate everyone else too aggressively. They stop imagining that anyone is quietly narrating them back. By 2 a.m. she was gone. Cole too. The ballroom half dismantled. The flowers beginning their second life as evidence-adjacent decor in a scandal house. I walked through the room once before bed. The projection wall dark. Chairs crooked. Coffee cups abandoned. One donor program on the floor near table 4 with the corner bent where somebody had stood on it without noticing. I picked it up, folded it, and put it in my pocket. Not as keepsake. As reminder. Beautiful events can become crime scenes without losing their linen. That was all. No triumphant prosecutor speech. No instant handcuffs. Real life rarely gives villains the choreography they deserve on the night they deserve it. But consequences had begun. That was enough. The next morning the town woke up into 2 versions of the story. One was the fast one. The banker called the lender. The lender froze disbursement and demanded immediate clarification. The paper's arts editor killed the puff piece Vivian's consultant had basically pre-written and instead ran a restrained, devastating headline about governance questions at Harthouse Memorial Gala. Lucy packed a bag and left her parents' rental before noon. Marlene sent an email to every school partner saying children's programming would continue uninterrupted and that rumors of privatization had been greatly exaggerated, which in educator language is as close to public execution as manners allow. The other version of the story unfolded slower and meant more. Volunteers came anyway. At 9, Miriam was in the rose beds cursing aphids with the same devotion as ever. At 10, a third-grade bus still pulled into the lower lane. At 11, 2 little girls stood in the fern house arguing about whether one particular orchid looked more like a dragon or a disappointed ant. The place went on. That mattered. Institutions survive betrayal best when ordinary use refuses to pause for it. Vivian called 6 times that day. I did not answer. At 4 she came in person. Not to Harthouse. To my private kitchen. That boundary mattered to her, I think. Or maybe she thought one room in the world might still be arranged to favor her if she chose the right doorway. I was at the table with Ruth and Dennis reviewing preliminary audit requests when she walked in without waiting to be asked. She looked awful. Beautiful still, of course. Some women are. But beauty under collapse acquires a special mean edge, like cracked porcelain trying to behave like marble. Ruth stood to leave. I shook my head. Stay. Vivian stopped. Really? Really? She looked at Dennis. And him. Especially him. That told her immediately this was no longer a father-daughter argument. This was record. Good. She dropped her bag on the chair and said, Cole says the debt note can still be restructured if you publicly clarify that the trust activation was overcautious and not evidence of fraud. There it was. No apology. No shame. Still negotiating the fire. Does he? I said. Dad, listen to me. If this becomes formal, the whole estate gets dragged through review. Donors get spooked. Programs suffer. Lucy gets pulled into it. You may win whatever little personal point you think this is, but Harthouse loses. You mean Cole loses? We all lose. Ruth, who had restrained herself heroically for nearly 16 hours, said, "No, Vivian. Some of us merely stop subsidizing your appetite." Vivian ignored her. "Eyes on me. You never wanted me in control. That's what this is really about." I considered the question because unlike her, I try not to waste accurate moments. "No," I said finally. "I never wanted you in control before you understood the difference between holding something and owning the right to change it." She laughed once, bitter. "Mom would have given me more room. Your mother gave you every room you ever asked for. You wanted the walls deeded over too." For the first time that day, she faltered. Then, quieter, she said, "Do you know what it was like growing up here? Every table had strangers at it. Every Saturday belonged to tours. Every holiday got rearranged around bulbs or grants or school buses or weather. Mom loved this place more easily than he loved people." That landed. Because it was not fully false. Margaret did give herself away to Harthouse at times in ways that left the family to compete with public goodness. The problem with partial truth is that it tempts the listener to overpay. I did not. "You were harmed by some of our priorities," I said. "You were not authorized to convert that hurt into theft." Tears came then. Real ones, I think. Not the useful kind. Hotter. Angrier. Younger. I was trying to build something I could finally control. You were trying to monetize what other people kept alive. Same difference. There it was. There, in 4 words, was the final fact of my daughter. Same difference. A school greenhouse and a boutique suite. Public trust and family revenue. Memory and marketing. Same difference. No, they weren't. And because they weren't, there was nothing left to save in that conversation except honesty. So I gave it to her. "Here is what happens next," I said. "You resign from any claim to Harthouse governance. You cooperate fully with the audit. You turn over every device, draft, deck, and communication tied to Mercer Living Partners. You publicly acknowledge that the Memorial Gala presentation misrepresented both the land status and your mother's wishes. If you do that, I will not spend the rest of my life trying to ruin you personally. I will spend it protecting the institution you tried to use." She stared at me. "And if I don't? Then the process continues without your dignity in mind." Ruth smiled into her coffee. Vivian looked from me to Ruth to Dennis and understood at last that the room would not tilt toward her if she kept speaking. She picked up her bag. At the door she stopped and said, without turning, "You always cared more about the house than about me." I answered before the old guilt could reach for me. "No. I cared about the line between love and permission. You spent years pretending there wasn't one." She left. That was the last private conversation we had for almost 5 months. The weeks after the gala taught me something I wish more people understood about public disgrace. It is not one event. It is a weather system. The first 72 hours belong to shock. Phone calls. Advisors. Board statements revised 12 times to remove any sentence that could later be read as either admission or cowardice, which in institutional writing are often the same sentence with one adverb changed. The local paper called every 6 hours. Regional preservation circles began their little chain reactions of alarm and delight because no community enjoys a governance scandal more than one built entirely out of people who claim to hate vulgarity. The county wanted copies of everything. The lender wanted assurances that every representation made in donor contexts had been preserved. 3 donors wanted private meetings. 2 wanted distance. 1 sent flowers as if petals could resolve security's anxiety. The next month belonged to sorting. Sorting files. Sorting loyalties. Sorting the dead language from the living one. Which board members had been vain? Which had been lazy? Which had been frightened? Which had been actively helpful to Vivian and Cole once they smelled transition in the room? Human motive never arrives pre-labeled, unfortunately. You have to infer it from calendars, emails, the order in which people begin using phrases like "to my understanding." Ruth enjoyed that phase more than any healthy person should. She sat in the boardroom with a legal pad and made men say exactly what they thought they had been agreeing to when they nodded along at private continuity conversations. One donor admitted he had assumed my consent was secured because Vivian spoke with that sort of confident daughterly authority. Ruth wrote down daughterly authority and circled it so hard the pen nearly tore the page. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked him. He looked miserable. Good. Certain forms of class confidence should ache once in a while. Charles Hensley became unexpectedly useful in the second week because panic had finally stripped vanity out of him. He produced email threads he should have produced sooner. Meeting notes he had pretended not to keep. A calendar invite showing that Cole had scheduled a private lender breakfast explicitly around post-memorial momentum window. Momentum window. Even now that phrase makes me want to throw crockery. It turned grief into a timing asset so cleanly that no jury in the world would ever need a poet to understand the offense. Dennis built the financial map from there. Not the pretty donor version. The real one. Bridge note due dates. Consulting invoices. Advisory transfers. Which expenses were foundation adjacent? Which were fully private and only disguised as strategic cultivation? Where Harrow Strategic had billed branding support that later proved to include slide design for the residential pitch. Which dinners had been reimbursed as stewardship when they had actually been investor prospecting? The more he found, the less glamorous the scheme became. That is the gift of proper accounting. It strips mythology off greed until all that remains are line items and appetite. No visionary transformation. No intergenerational stewardship. Just leverage, debt pressure, and two polished people trying to turn a memorial room into a liquidity event. Lucy helped in ways I still think cost her more than she showed. She turned over every draft file she had ever touched, every iteration of the site plans, every message where her mother nudged her toward cleaner presentation, softer labels, less alarming wall lines, more emotional continuity. In one message Vivian had written, "We need the space to feel inevitable, not invasive." That sentence became one of Dana's favorites. She said it contained the whole case in miniature. A person does not spend that much effort on inevitability unless invasion is already sitting in the bones of the plan. Lucy also sat for an interview with County Council. Not because anyone wanted to drag a granddaughter into public record if it could be avoided. Because truth moves cleaner when the young stop protecting adults who have mistaken them for design accessories. She told them about the plunge pools. The disguised drive. The request to soften walls into garden forms. The way her mother talked about Grandma's memorial audience as the exact emotional mix for launch acceptance. I was not in the room when she said it. I am grateful. If I had heard that line live, I might have lost the very composure everybody kept congratulating me for having. Cole spent the same month trying every salvage strategy available to men whose confidence has long outrun their collateral. First indignation. Then minimization. Then procedural outrage. Then selective concern about my health because once again, when all else fails, ambitious relatives return to widower fragility the way weak swimmers return to the wall. One week he claimed the whole thing had been conceptual exploration and that only my emotional overreading had transformed responsible planning into scandal. The next week he argued privately, through counsel, that public correction could still preserve value if I issued a narrow statement clarifying that family grief had complicated sequencing. Sequencing. That word joined momentum window on the list of phrases I would cheerfully bury under stones. By the third week he stopped speaking in abstractions and began asking what it would take for me to halt wider review. There is always a moment when men like him discover they cannot charm an old man out of evidence and therefore must price her instead. He came to the house once during that phase without invitation. Not to Hart House offices. To my side porch. Late afternoon. Rain threatening. No tie. Expensive coat open. Trying to look human enough that pity might make a fatal accounting error. I let him stand in the doorway for exactly 10 seconds before saying, "If this is an apology, it has taken the wrong shape." He gave a little half laugh. "I don't think you'd know what to do with one from me. Try me." He did not. Instead he looked out toward the east lawn and said, "You know the place needs money." That was his deepest flaw. Not greed. Not nerve. Contempt for moral distinction. He honestly believed if he could identify a real problem, every dirty cure beneath it became negotiable. "Yes," I said. "I also know the difference between raising it and packaging access. You think anyone underwrites old estates now without experience attached? Children have had experiences here for 40 years. You know what I mean." "I do. That is why I dislike you so consistently." He flinched. Not because the insult was elegant. Because it was accurate and old. There is a special humiliation in discovering you have not been misread, only observed for longer than you hoped. Then he tried his last useful argument. Vivian. Not his own debt. Not his reputation. Vivian. She was trying to earn a life that wasn't only inherited rules, he said. You built a world where love always had conditions attached to maintenance. That line stung because, like all efficient lies, it carried one nerve of truth inside it. Hart House did shape family life. There were weekends lost to storms and tours and donor emergencies and collapsed pipes and school programs and budgets that refused to soften just because Christmas had arrived. Vivian did grow up around constant obligation. She did watch me choose bylaws at midnight and Margaret answer town requests at breakfast. There is family damage inside public duty. I know that. But again. Partial truth tempts overpayment. So she sold the conditions back to us at luxury margin, I said. Cole looked away. Rain started then. Light at first. Sharp on the rail. He finally asked the real question. What would end this? Honesty. He almost smiled. You know I mean practically. No, I said. I mean exactly what I said. Public acknowledgement. Full resignation. Complete production. No narrative laundering through concern or process. And if Vivian won't? Then you both learn what old paper does when it finally gets bored. He left after that. No threat. No pleading. Just the particular stiffness men develop when they arrive hoping to negotiate and leave having discovered the other party was never in the market. Vivian held out longer. Not publicly. Publicly she was advised into restraint. Privately she cycled through shame, anger, strategic silence, and one short ugly burst of nostalgia she sent in a handwritten note. The note arrived on cream stationery I recognized from her wedding set. That detail alone nearly made me throw it away unread. Instead I opened it. She wrote about childhood. The potting bench fort. The winter she and Margaret built paper lanterns for the greenhouse walk. The year the roof leaked over the piano and he said every honorable house eventually cries in public. Then she wrote one line that explained her better than all our arguments had. I got tired of being told that love meant preserving what I didn't choose. I sat with that sentence a long time. Because there, finally, was her real grievance. Not just money. Inheritance philosophy. She believed that receiving beauty with obligations attached was itself a form of theft against her adulthood. And because she believed that, she gave herself permission to invert the arrangement. If duty felt imposed, then monetizing the duty looked like liberation. Wrong. But clear. I did not answer the note. Some truths do not improve through correspondence. The county hearing in November made everything harder and cleaner at once. Not court. Not yet. Hearing. Public enough to matter. Technical enough to bore half the room. Exactly the sort of setting where real consequences often begin while ordinary people assume nothing dramatic is happening. We sat under fluorescent lights in a chamber that smelled faintly of dust and copied paper. One side of the room held county council, preservation staff, 2 board members, and Dennis with 3 binders tabbed like a man preparing to perform surgery on a spreadsheet. The other held Cole, Vivian, their lawyer, and 2 consultants who had the bad luck to look decorative rather than serious that morning. Ruth sat beside me smiling the way falcons probably smile internally over field mice. What mattered there was not theater. It was sequence. County maps first. Then trust language. Then the reversion trigger. Then donor deck comparisons. Then the county inquiry about delaying automatic reversion. Then the edited hospice clip. Then the raw clip. Then the draft delegation page. Then the financial model showing donor-dependent residential occupancy assumptions bundled into the so-called memorial phase. No single piece alone would have given me the clean moral pleasure people dream about. Together they built something better. An ugly inevitability. At one point County Council asked Cole whether he had or had not described Parcel C as functionally available subject to governance finalization in a lender-side memo. He tried to explain market custom. Dennis slid the memo copy forward. The room got quiet in the right way. Not shocked. Done. Vivian spoke only once that day on her own. Her lawyer had clearly instructed caution, but caution loses oxygen when shame and old fury share a bloodstream. She said, the estate was stagnating under sentiment. I looked at her then and understood something that did not soften me but did simplify the rest of my life. She really believed it. Not the whole fraud web. Not the edits and pressures and hidden debt. But the central insult, yes. She truly believed Hart House had been insufficiently monetized by people who loved it too literally. County Council replied before I could. Sentiment is not the issue before us, Ms. Mercer. Authority is. God bless competent women in municipal law. No one writes sonnets for them. Civilization should. After the hearing the press finally got sharper. Not crueler. Clearer. The first round of coverage had still carried the possibility of family disagreement complicated by legal nuance. After the county sequence and the lender memo, that generous fog burned off. Articles began using words like misrepresentation, governance breach, commercial conversion risk. Donor circles began pretending they had always been uneasy. Old money is never so morally impressive as after it realizes it almost funded something vulgar. By winter the town had chosen its version of the story too. That matters more than outsiders think. Institutions survive through local memory, not regional headlines. And the town, for all its appetite for gossip, understood what had been threatened. Not simply my position. The habit of public access itself. Mothers who used to bring children for butterfly days stopped me at the grocer and squeezed my arm. A retired teacher left a note in my mailbox that said, "Keep the meadow open." My grandson learned running there before he learned reading. Gus received unsolicited offers from 3 local contractors to help reinforce the lower greenhouse roof at cost. Miriam, whose opinions had never once required invitation, began introducing me to new volunteers as the man who made rich people lose their appetite in public. That may be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about me. The hardest part came in January. Not the legal review. Not the donor cleanup. Not even the cold. Lucy moved some of her things from Boston into the carriage house apartment and Vivian came by unannounced to see her. They argued on the East Walk. I did not mean to overhear. Places like Hart House make accidental witnesses of everyone because doors and windows were designed for air before privacy became a professional religion. Lucy said, "You keep talking like this was bold and necessary. It was ugly and small." Vivian said, "You have no idea what it feels like to spend your whole life orbiting other people's meaning." Lucy answered, "Then you should have made your own. Not sold Grandma's." I went into the pantry after that and stood with one hand on a jar shelf until the shaking passed. Not because the argument was new. Because hearing the generations split cleanly enough to echo made the cost feel fresh. Later that night Lucy found me in the old laundry room and asked, "Do you think she'll ever understand what she did?" I answered honestly, "No. But she may one day understand what it cost her." "Is that enough?" "No," I said. "Enough is a fantasy. We settle for true." She nodded. That girl was always better at true than enough. By February the legal edges had mostly settled. Not with cinematic punishment. With narrowing. Which is its own form of sentence among ambitious people. Cole could still work, technically. Just not where anyone serious handled public trust assets. Vivian could still speak, network, consult, propose, smile. But rooms had changed. The old easy assumption of moral fluency had gone. People now asked follow-up questions. They read footnotes. They requested originals. That kind of reputational narrowing looks minor to outsiders. It is not. For people built on smooth access, it is a kind of oxygen tax. And for me. For Hart House. For the meadow. For the children who still arrived in muddy shoes and too loud voices. For the volunteers who still treated a public path like a shared inheritance instead of ambience. For Margaret's memory. Narrowing was enough. Not satisfying. Not whole. But enough to keep the right gates open and the wrong doors closed. Some nights, after everyone has gone and the lower hall is quiet and the boilers are settling into winter discipline, I still think about the version of my daughter who once slept on seed catalogs and believed lilies opened faster if she stayed nearby. Then I think about the woman who stood in a ballroom and tried to leverage her mother's death into premium occupancy. Both people existed. That is the part nobody tells you. Betrayal does not erase former innocence. It cheapens your access to it. So I do not comfort myself with stories about monsters who were always obvious. I comfort myself with narrower truths. I read more carefully now. I trust younger women faster when they are awkward and honest. I never ignore a consultant who speaks in polished weather. And when someone uses the word burden around public land, I listen as if the room already contains a match. That is not bitterness. That is maintenance. Hart House was built on it. So, increasingly, am I. The audit moved faster than Cole expected and slower than I wanted. That is law. That is money. That is adulthood after spectacle. Phones were collected. Files were preserved. The forged page led to more draft materials. The debt structure led to side consulting fees that had been routed through Harrow Strategic. The edited hospice clip surfaced in 2 donor decks. Lucy's renderings proved the project intent was never merely educational residency. Dennis connected 3 expense reimbursements from foundation-related hospitality visits to private pitch meetings that never should have been billed anywhere near us. By November, Cole had dissolved Mercer Living Partners under pressure from counsel. By December, the lender had sued on the bridge note. By January, his reputation in the regional preservation world had narrowed to the width it deserved. Men who sell exclusivity around public land do not recover well once old money realizes they were invited to underwrite vulgarity. Vivian resigned from the board in a letter so beautifully phrased it almost convinced me she still believed language could launder intent. It could not. Dana's office stopped short of criminal charges in the first round. There had been too much soft phrasing, too many drafts, too much nearly but not fully executed paper for the immediate satisfaction people like me sometimes dream about at 3 in the morning. But civil exposure remained. Governance sanctions landed. Public reporting requirements tightened. Donor counsel filed claims tied to misrepresentation. The estate was protected. The trust held. The land stayed public. And sometimes that is what justice looks like when the guilty are clever enough to avoid one cliff but too arrogant to miss the mountain. Lucy moved into the old carriage house apartment for the spring term and took over restoration planning for the children's greenhouse. She and Miriam redesigned the East Meadow path so school groups could reach the Fern House without crossing the donor lane. On her second week there she brought me a revised site plan and said, no pools. No guest parking. But I did give the butterfly beds more room to misbehave. I kissed her forehead and thought, not for the first time, that redemption often enters a family through the youngest honest woman left standing. In March we held a smaller gathering. No projection screens. No strategic reveal. Just donors, staff, schoolchildren, tea, and a new plaque at the East Walk. Margaret Hart Public Garden Meadow. Preserved for educational and civic use under the Hart Educational Trust. The bronze letters caught spring light beautifully. I stood there with Ruth beside me and Father James misquoting scripture in a way that somehow improved it, while children ran ahead toward the first daffodils and nobody charged them premium occupancy for the privilege. A reporter asked whether I considered the previous autumn a painful family rupture. I told her the truth. No, I said. I consider it a very expensive misunderstanding about what could be sold. Then I walked away before she could make me softer for print. People still ask whether I regret doing it publicly. What they mean is whether I regret letting my daughter fall in the same room where she thought she would rise. I do not enjoy that answer. But I know it. No, I do not regret it. Because privacy had been the instrument of the harm. Private decks. Private debt. Private edits. Private assurances. Private concern about my judgment. Private conversion of public promise into family leverage. The whole machine depended on small hidden rooms where language could be thinned until it no longer sounded like theft. It had to break in front of witnesses or it would never fully break at all. That was the revenge, if you want to call it that. Not prison. Not ruin for the joy of ruin. Something more exact. I let them spend their certainty. I let them build their stage. I let them move my seat, polish my replacement, quote my wife badly, borrow against applause they had not yet earned, and invite the whole town to watch them inherit what they thought grief had softened for collection. Then I took away the land. Then the narrative. Then the room. And when they finally spoke honestly, it was into microphones they had arranged for themselves. I still miss my daughter sometimes. Not the woman from the Gala. The smaller versions. The 8-year-old who used to sleep with seed packets under her pillow because she thought flowers might arrive faster if she stayed close to their instructions. The 13-year-old who once sat under the potting bench for 2 hours because a wounded robin trusted stillness more than adults. The 20-year-old who phoned me from college just to ask how to get candle wax out of linen because she had set a boys' dorm room table on fire and did not want to sound unserious while confessing it. Those versions were real too. That may be the cruelest part. Villains are easier when they were always monstrous. My daughter was not always monstrous. She was loved badly in some ways, admired too quickly in others, and eventually seduced by the idea that beauty, grief, land, and memory are just premium materials waiting for a better business model. Somewhere along the line she accepted that equation. I never will. The house is quieter now. Margaret's dressing room still holds her scarves. The mirror is still too small. The East Meadow is open to children again. In the greenhouse, the orchids remain temperamental and therefore morally correct. Ruth still comes every Thursday with legal gossip and disapproval for the world at large. Lucy leaves pencils everywhere and acts surprised each time I find them. Miriam continues speaking to roses as if they are unionized. Father James still dozes during long donor remarks and calls it listening inward. Life did not become pure after the gala. Nothing does. But it became honest again. And honesty, unlike luxury residences, tends to age well on old land. Sometimes late in the evening I walk the donor path alone and stop at the bend where the first rendering had placed a stone wall and a private drive. I stand there and look across the meadow toward the winter garden lights and try to imagine what Harthill would have become if I had mistaken silence for mercy one more time. I can imagine it too easily now. A valet lane. Muted landscaping. Curated stays. A little brass plaque about Margaret in a lobby where strangers would use her name as atmosphere on their way to expensive linens. And somewhere in that future, my daughter moving through the rooms with a practiced smile, telling guests how difficult the transition had been after my health declined. That future died in the ballroom before the coffee service. Good. Some futures deserve to. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is not the cheap one about trusting no one. Trust is necessary. Gardens need it. Families certainly try. The real lesson is smaller and harder. Read every line people ask you to accept in a soft voice. Especially if money gets quieter when grief enters the room. Especially if someone tells you concern and control are the same thing. Especially if they start moving your seat before they've earned the right to speak from the podium. My daughter wanted inheritance. Cole wanted leverage. What they got was a very public education in deeds, recordings, and the dangers of assuming a tired old man has forgotten who wrote the rules. I had not. I never did.